The city is quiet, the lights are low. You've closed the door on the day's noise, and now we dive into the silence. Welcome to Midnight Narrative. This content is a narrative based on public records and is intended as a non graphic, peaceful bedtime story. Tonight, the case file is open on Lizzie Borden. The story of a crime is often told by the people it leaves behind. But sometimes, if you listen closely, the most honest witness is the house itself. The house at 92 Second Street in Fall River, Massachusetts was such a witness. It was a narrow 2.5 story clapboard structure, painted a drab olive green, pressed tight against its neighbors on a busy, unglamorous street. It did not speak of wealth, but of stubborn, unyielding practicality. And inside, this house held its breath. Inside, the house feels close. The rooms connect like links in a chain, a design common for the time, but one that bred a peculiar kind of intimacy, an intimacy without warmth. To move from one space to another, you must pass through someone else's world. The front staircase, for instance, led from the main entryway to the second floor. But to get to the back of the house or to the maid's attic room, one had to use a separate, steep set of stairs off the kitchen. It was a home of segregated pathways. Privacy isn't built in, it's earned, or more often, it is taken by locking a door. On the ground floor, there is a front parlor for guests, furnished with respectable but stiff horsehair furniture, perpetually shrouded in dust cloths. It is a room for display, not for living, and it is rarely used. Beyond it lies the sitting room, smaller, more practical, where the family gathers. This is where family talk, or more often, a heavy, unspoken silence sits between them. Adjacent is the dining room, square, plain, tidy, where tense, frugal meals are consumed. And at the very back, there is the kitchen, the pulse of the house, a place of heat, work, and the simmering of more than just leftover stew. Upstairs, the pattern repeats. Compact rooms pressed together, each one a container for a different soul. At the front is the guest bedroom, a space of transient occupation, most recently for a visiting uncle. Next to it, a small room that Lizzie Borden uses as her own. Moving toward the back, you pass through the master bedroom, the domain of Andrew and his wife, Abby. To get to the maid's staircase or to Emma's room at the very rear, one must physically walk through the threshold of the parents' private space, a daily violation of boundaries. And high above it all, in the stifling heat of the attic, is the small, isolated room for Bridget Sullivan, the maid who lives in the house but was never truly a part of the family. It is not a large home, not for the money they have, not by a long shot, and that is where the first tension lives. It lives in the cramped hallways, in the thin walls that fail to muffle a raised voice, and in the constant, unavoidable presence of one another. The house itself is a pressure cooker, and by the summer of 1892, the heat inside is becoming unbearable. Andrew Jackson Borden, 70 years old, a man built from the granite of New England thrift. He was a man of means, though he walks and talks like one without them. He was once an undertaker, a profession that perhaps instilled in him a deep comfort with silence, finality, and the grim accounting of life and death. From that morbid beginning, he built an empire. His wealth comes from hard edges, shrewd real estate investments, ownership of bank stock, and shares in the city's humming textile mills. But he dresses in a uniform of sober black broadcloth, eats simple, often day old food, and sleeps behind a fortress of locked doors. He believes thrift is a moral virtue. Waste is a sign of weak character. Comfort, when unnecessary, is a sin of pride. His house reflects his values: narrow halls, plain furniture, every object relentlessly functional. The absence of modern conveniences like gaslighting or a telephone was not an oversight. It was a choice. Andrew saw no need to pay for what kerosene and his own 2 feet could provide. To Andrew, this was virtue made visible, a daily testament to his fiscal discipline. To others, including his 2 grown daughters, it is a cage built out of economy. It is a constant public reminder of their father's withholding nature. They are the daughters of one of the richest men in Fall River, yet they live a life of stark, almost embarrassing austerity. He is respected in town for his business acumen, but not loved. Those who do business with him call him careful. Those who know him more intimately call him cold. He is not known for his generosity or his warmth. Stories circulate of his sharp dealings, of his willingness to foreclose on a property without a second thought. He is a man of numbers, not nuances. He carries keys, always, a ring of them, heavy and metallic, kept close to his person. They are a symbol of his power, a tangible representation of his ownership. Locks are part of his order. They separate what's his from what isn't. He locks the front door, the back door, the cellar, and even the doors to the bedrooms. This obsession with security speaks not of a man who feels safe, but of a man who lives in constant fear of losing what he has accumulated. He trusts locks more than he trusts people, even those living under his own roof. Her name is Abby Durfee Gray Borden, Andrew's second wife. At 64, she is a stout, heavy-set woman, her movements slowed by her weight. She is, by all accounts, a simple and practical woman, patient and inclined toward keeping the peace in a household where peace is a fragile commodity. She entered this family 30 years prior, stepping into the void left by the death of Andrew's first wife, Sarah, the mother of Lizzie and Emma. Abby was 37 at the time, a spinster with few prospects, and her marriage to the widowed Andrew Borden was a practical arrangement. She tried to step carefully to manage a household that was not truly hers in spirit, a home still haunted by the ghost of the woman who came before her. She cooked or supervised the cooking. She ordered supplies, she kept the home respectable, and she endured the suffocating frugality of her husband. But respect doesn't guarantee affection. The daughters, Emma and Lizzie, called her Mrs. Borden, never mother. The title was a wall they built between them, a constant reminder that she was and always would be the outsider. When they were children, the relationship was reportedly warmer. But as the girls grew into women and the reality of their inheritance became a pressing concern, the distance grew into a cold, unbridgeable gulf. The distance between them wasn't measured in rooms, it was measured in trust, and there was very little of it. The tension was rooted in the primal fear of displacement. The daughters saw Abby not just as their father's wife, but as the primary obstacle to their own financial futures. Every small gift or piece of property Andrew bestowed upon Abby or her family was seen as a direct theft from their own inheritance. In the days leading up to August 4th, Abby was worried. A strange and violent sickness had gone through the household, causing severe vomiting. She spoke to the family doctor, Dr. Bowen, confiding in him her fear that they were being poisoned. Andrew, ever the pragmatist, dismissed her worries as feminine anxiety, blaming the illness on spoiled swordfish that, in his typical fashion, he had insisted the family continue to eat for several days. Abby stayed uneasy anyway. She felt a palpable sense of menace in the air, a threat she couldn't name but could feel in the strange quiet of the house. She was a woman in the middle, caught between a withholding husband and 2 resentful stepdaughters, and her instinct for self preservation was sounding a silent, desperate alarm. The Borden sisters were 2 sides of the same coin, both stamped with the imprint of their father's oppressive nature. Emma Borden, 42 years old, the elder sister, quiet, anxious, dutiful. She was the shadow in the room that never complains. She'd long ago learned that the easiest way to avoid conflict in the Borden house was to disappear into silence. She was her father's daughter in her frugality and her reserved nature. Where Lizzie bristled, Emma endured. Then there was Lizzie, 32 years old, unmarried, intelligent, energetic, and known for her active role in the Central Congregational Church and the Woman's Christian Temperance Union. She was also known in hushed tones for a stubborn streak and a temper that could flare when she was crossed. Fall River knew her as a charitable, refined, modern woman. She was a far more public figure than anyone else in her family. She had even taken a grand tour of Europe with her friends, a glimpse into a world of art, culture, and freedom that must have made her return to the gloomy house on Second Street feel like stepping back into a cage. Inside her own house, she was restless. She wanted more space in every sense of the word. Lizzie had traveled, seen how others of her father's wealth lived, up on "the hill," as locals called it, where grand Victorian homes were set back on green lawns with airy porches, modern plumbing, and a sense of taste that replaced mere thrift. The Bordens could have lived there too, but Andrew refused. He said it was unnecessary. For Lizzie, that refusal wasn't about location. It was about status, about appearance, about control. It was a public declaration of his power over her and her sister. By 1892, the air between father and daughter had turned stale. The breaking point had come over property. When Lizzie discovered that her father had purchased a house for Abby's half sister, she and Emma were furious. It was a formal transfer of what they considered their assets to Abby's bloodline. They confronted their father, and the resulting argument was so bitter that Andrew, in a rare act of concession, granted them ownership of a rental property to soothe their anger. But the damage was done. The transaction had laid bare the financial fault lines running through the family. In the weeks before the murders, Emma, weary of the constant tension, did what she always did. She retreated. She left town to visit friends in Fairhaven, hoping, perhaps, that distance would cool what words could not. That left Lizzie and Abby alone under the same roof, together but not together. Two women, one guarding her position, the other resenting her confinement. And in that house, silence became its own language, a vocabulary of slammed doors, heavy footsteps, and averted eyes. Her name was Bridget Sullivan, though the Bordens called her Maggie, the name of their previous maid. It was a casual cruelty, a daily erasure of her identity. She was 26, an immigrant from Ireland, one of the thousands who came to America seeking a better life and found instead grueling service. She was hardworking, honest, and chronically exhausted. Her world was circumscribed by her duties. Her attic room was suffocatingly hot in the summer and freezing cold in the winter. She worked from dawn until after dinner 6 days a week for a wage of $3.50. She cooked, cleaned, polished, and served meals she rarely ate with the family, taking hers alone in the kitchen. Bridget saw everything, and she said little. She was an invisible observer of the family's slow motion collapse. She knew when the tension in the dining room was thick enough to taste. She heard the raised, angry voices through the thin walls, arguments that would suddenly cease the moment she entered a room. She watched as the family members moved around each other like hostile ghosts. Days before the murders, she too had fallen violently ill, vomiting in the backyard. She blamed it on the leftover mutton stew they had been reheating and serving for several meals. In the oppressive August heat, food spoiled quickly. Still, Andrew, ever wasteful not, insisted they finish it. Bridget's illness was a physical manifestation of the sickness in the house itself. Bridget Sullivan didn't know that soon. The testimony of an exhausted Irish maid would be the central pillar of a murder trial that would grip the nation. She didn't know that every detail she observed, a locked door, a strange laugh, a quiet instruction to go to her room, would be scrutinized, debated, and reinterpreted for more than a century to come. The Borden home was a fortress of habit and paranoia. Doors were locked from the inside, often with multiple bolts. Rooms were only accessible through other rooms, and keys, Andrew Borden's keys, were always kept close. This labyrinthine security created a bizarre paradox. The house was a fortress against the outside world, but it offered no real safety within. To move between spaces, one often had to pass through a room occupied by another or find a door unlocked. It created a world of choke points and blind spots. If someone screamed upstairs in the front of the house, the sound might not travel clearly to the kitchen at the back. If someone moved from room to room, others might not notice until it was too late. The very architecture of the house made surveillance and secrecy possible at the same time. On the morning of August 4th, these very locks would become a central mystery. Andrew would return home to find himself locked out. Bridget would struggle to open the door from the inside. Who had locked it and why? These simple questions, born from the family's obsessive habits, would complicate the story for investigators and fuel speculation for more than a century. The locks meant to keep danger out may have, in the end, simply trapped it inside. To understand the Bordens, you have to understand Fall River. It was a city of granite and smoke built on the power of the Kekashan River, which plummeted down a series of falls on its way to the sea. This natural energy fueled the great textile mills that dominated the city's economy and its skyline. It was a town divided by class as sharply as by its streets. The wealthy mill owners and bank presidents lived up on the hill in large ornate Victorian homes surrounded by lawns and trees. Here, the air was cleaner, the streets were quieter, and life was conducted with a sense of refined leisure. Below, in the crowded, bustling lower part of town, the working class lived in cramped tenement buildings near the mills, where industrial smoke mixed with the sweat of labor, and rent came due even when wages fell short. This was the world of the immigrant laborers, Irish, French Canadian, Portuguese, who worked the dangerous, deafening looms for meager pay. Andrew Borden lived between these worlds. He was wealthy enough to move up, but frugal and perhaps disdainful enough to stay down. His house on 2nd Street was firmly in the downtown commercial district, a noisy, dusty, and unfashionable address for a man of his stature. To his peers, this was a strange, eccentric choice. To his daughters, especially Lizzie, it felt like a deliberate punishment, a daily reminder of their social confinement. There were other tensions too: the religious, the ethnic, the generational. The established Yankee families like the Bordens, who had been there for generations, clung to their traditions and their control of the city's institutions. But change was in the air, in the languages spoken on the street, and in the growing unrest among the labor force. The Borden family, in its rigid, self imposed isolation, was a microcosm of an old order resisting the pressures of a new world. By the first week of August, the household had fallen into its uneasy rhythm. Emma was away, a fact that would later seem like a calculated escape. John Morse, Andrew's brother in law from his first marriage, had arrived for his visit. He was a stoic, imposing figure who had shared the ill fated mutton for breakfast with the family on Wednesday and had spent a long evening discussing business with Andrew. He slept in the guest room upstairs, the very room that would soon become a place of horror. He left early on the morning of August 4th to visit other relatives, unaware that by midday, the home he'd just slept in would be the most infamous address in America. Bridget rose early that day, too. Her stomach is still uneasy. She opened windows to the suffocating air, fetched water from the cellar, and began the endless loop of her chores, her movements a familiar rhythmic punctuation to the morning. Abby made her rounds, tidying rooms, dusting furniture, and preparing for what she believed would be an ordinary day. Her last domestic act would be to change the linens on the bed her guest had just vacated, and Lizzie was restless. Just days before, she had visited her friend, Alice Russell, and had spoken in a tone of deep distress. She felt unsafe in the house, she said. Strange things had been happening. There had been a recent robbery in the barn. She'd heard whispers. She had a sense that someone meant them harm, that her father had enemies who were closing in. She spoke in a tone half complaint, half warning. Was it a genuine premonition of danger or the careful laying of a false trail? Alice Russell, like everyone else, did not know what to make of it. Later, when the police attempted to piece the timeline together, they would realize this morning had been planned or had unfolded in a strange and perfect stillness. The sequence of events was a chain of mundane actions, each one leading inexorably toward the final, violent conclusion. Each person moved through their routine. Each believed they were safe. Each passed within feet of the other, their paths crossing in the narrow hallways and on the cramped staircases. And the house watched. By 11:15 that morning, two people in that house would be dead. A third would be under suspicion, and the rest of the town and the nation would be forever changed by the brutal, bloody secrets that were finally unleashed from within the quiet walls of 92 Second Street. Fall River in 1892 was not a sleepy New England town. It was a granite hard, smoke stained engine of industry, one of the great textile centers of the nation, known as Spindle City. Its lifeblood was the Kekeshan River, which cascaded down a steep granite cliff, providing the immense water power needed to drive the looms of dozens of sprawling cotton mills. Thousands of people, mostly immigrants from Ireland, French Canada, and Portugal, worked in these mills. They spent 12-hour days in long, lint filled rooms, their ears ringing with the deafening roar of the machinery, their lungs thick with cotton dust. For them, Fall River was a place of grueling labor and the constant struggle for survival. Wealth, however, lived only a few blocks away and a world apart. The families who owned the mills or, like Andrew Borden, invested in them were the invisible architects of this laboring city. They were the Yankee elite, the established families who controlled the banks, the courts, and the social hierarchies. Their world was the Hill, a fashionable neighborhood where the air felt lighter and the soot from the mills rarely settled. Here, grand Victorian mansions with manicured lawns, airy porches, and modern amenities sat in judgment over the crowded city below. This was a world of quiet afternoons, of social calls, of daughters who were presented to society and expected to marry well, consolidating family fortunes and reputations. For the upper class, Fall River meant control. And for those caught between, like Lizzie and Emma Borden, it meant a constant gnawing frustration. The daughters of Andrew Borden had grown up in comfort, but not luxury. They were educated, well dressed, and had the leisure to pursue hobbies and charity work, but they were denied the status that their father's immense wealth should have afforded them. They had seen the finer houses on the hill, they had attended parties in them. Lizzie, especially having returned from a grand tour of Europe, was keenly aware of the stark contrast between that world of art and refinement and her own dark, cramped, and technologically backward home. Their father's refusal to move to a more fashionable address was both practical and personal. He believed a man's worth was not proven by his address, but by the size of his bank account. He saw the opulent lifestyles of his peers as wasteful and foolish. And perhaps, deep down, he also believed that luxury spoiled gratitude and bred weakness of character. He had built his fortune from nothing, and he seemed determined to deny his daughters the comforts that might make them forget the value of a dollar. But gratitude is not easily forced. For Lizzie, her father's choice felt less like a lesson in virtue and more like a public humiliation, a daily statement that she and her sister were not worthy of the life he could so easily provide. And resentment, especially when it is confined within small, airless rooms, has nowhere to go but inward, where it calcifies into something hard, cold, and dangerous. The Bordens were comfortable, but comfort is a word that can change shape depending on who defines it. For Andrew, comfort was the absence of debt and the knowledge of a full coffer. For his daughters, comfort was a world of social acceptance and personal freedom that remained tantalizingly out of reach. Andrew controlled the family's finances with an iron fist. Even his wife, Abby, a woman in her 60s who managed his household, relied on him for small sums of spending money. His daughters, both grown women, were given allowances but had no independent wealth. Their entire existence was predicated on their father's goodwill and his tightly held purse strings. This financial dependence was the source of his power and their subjugation. Years earlier, an event occurred that permanently fractured the family's fragile peace. Andrew had purchased a house on Ferry Street and gifted its use to Abby's half sister, Sarah Whitehead. Later, he formally transferred the deed into Abby's name. This act, meant perhaps as a kindness to his wife's family or as a simple property transaction, had the effect of a lit match dropped into a puddle of gasoline. Lizzie and Emma saw it as a profound betrayal. It was not just a house, it was a symbol. They believed their father had put his second wife's kin before his own daughters, diverting what they considered Borden assets to the Gray bloodline. It confirmed their deepest fear that when their father died, Abby would inherit a significant portion of his estate, which she would then pass on to her own relatives, leaving them, his biological daughters, with a diminished inheritance. The argument that followed was quiet, as Borden's arguments often were. There was no shouting match reported, no dramatic storming out. But silence in this home was never peace. It was a kind of suffocation, a pressure building behind closed doors. The result of this confrontation was a tense negotiation. To correct the imbalance, Andrew purchased their grandfather's former home and deeded it to Lizzie and Emma for the token sum of $1. On the surface, it was a resolution, but this clumsy financial transaction failed to mend the emotional wound. It was not an act of love or reconciliation, it was a business deal struck between hostile parties. The damage had already been done. From that point forward, the family was no longer a unit, but a collection of individuals guarding their own interests, with Lizzie at the forefront, watching her father's every financial move with the hawk like intensity of someone expecting to be cheated. In public, Lizzie Borden was a model of late Victorian respectability. If you were to ask a casual acquaintance to describe her, you would hear a list of virtues. She was a prominent and active member of the Central Congregational Church, a powerful institution in the city's Yankee society. She taught Sunday school to immigrant children. She was the secretary treasurer for the Woman's Christian Temperance Union, a movement dedicated to the moral improvement of society. She was active in the Fruit and Flower Mission, a charity that brought comfort to the sick and poor. She organized social gatherings, she dressed well, she spoke properly. The townspeople saw her as cultured, even refined. But they also whispered that she was proud, headstrong, and at times aloof. There was a sense that Lizzie Borden held herself slightly apart, that her engagement with the community was more of a performance of her station than a genuine expression of warmth. Fall River society, especially among the old established families, was a delicate web of politeness and rumor. Women were measured by their manners and their piety. Men were measured by their fortunes, and everyone was measured by what others said about them behind closed doors. Lizzie's public life was a careful construction, a presentation of the ideal daughter, the ideal citizen. It was a stark contrast to the sullen, resentful woman who was known to take her meals alone in her room to avoid her family. Her life was full of these small, sharp contradictions. She was a woman of leisure who had no real freedom. She was the daughter of a rich man who lived in enforced frugality. She was a beloved Sunday school teacher who was deeply resented by her own stepmother. She was a woman defined by what she did outside her home and trapped by who she was forced to be inside it. The gap between these two versions of Lizzie Borden was growing wider every day. In the summer of 1892, with Emma away, the Borden house had four adults living under one roof: Andrew, Abby, Lizzie, and Bridget the maid. But even with one less person, it still felt crowded, each individual's presence rubbing against the others like sandpaper. Each of them had their own rhythm, their own sense of territory within the house's claustrophobic confines. Andrew's domain was the sitting room, where he sat with his newspaper after his business walks, and where few dared disturb him. He was a creature of rigid habit, his movements predictable, his moods dour. Abby ruled the domestic sphere: the kitchen, the dining room, and the master bedroom. Her routine was precise: dusting, cooking, mending, and taking care of linens. She was a constant, bustling presence, her heavy footsteps a familiar sound on the stairs. She was the manager of a household that offered her little joy. Lizzie had staked her claim to her own upstairs bedroom. It was her sanctuary and her fortress. In the weeks leading up to the murders, she rarely ate with the family. Sometimes she would take her meals alone in her room, claiming a headache or a lack of appetite. This was more than just a preference. It was a silent protest, a way of withdrawing from the family unit she so deeply resented. In many houses, this would be seen as strange antisocial behavior, but in this house, it had become an expected part of the dysfunctional routine. They lived together, but they lived separately, their lives intersecting only at points of necessity or friction. And Bridget worked between them all. She was the connective tissue, the only person who moved freely through all the segregated territories. She carried water up from the cellar. She washed windows in every room. She served meals in the tense dining room, and she cleaned the private spaces of each family member. She heard the conversations not meant for her, saw the cold glances exchanged over the dinner table, and understood, better than anyone, the depth of the unhappiness that saturated the air. She saw more than anyone realized, and her silence was a condition of her employment. In the weeks of late July, leading into the suffocating heat of August, a series of small, strange events began to add up like tremors before an earthquake. They were minor incidents, easily dismissed on their own, but together they painted a picture of a household on the verge of collapse. A family argument sharper than usual. A door found mysteriously ajar when it was always kept locked. A shadow at the edge of someone's routine. A feeling of being watched. One day, Andrew discovered that his roll top desk, his personal sanctuary of finance and control, had been broken into. He was furious. Yet nothing of significant value was stolen, only some streetcar tokens, a bit of spare change, and a worthless commemorative medal. The triviality of the theft made it all the more unsettling. It wasn't an act of greed, it was an act of violation, a message sent. He dismissed it as a local thief, a common vagrant. But Lizzie would later tell her friends she believed the burglar had come from inside the house. And as strange as that sounds, she may have been right. In a home where doors were always locked against the outside world, an internal threat was the only logical explanation. Trust, already fractured here, was now shattered. Suspicion, once a quiet undercurrent, began to live openly in its place. The family members started watching each other, listening at doors, interpreting every small gesture as a potential threat. The house was no longer a home, it was a theater of paranoia. Wednesday, August 3rd, 1892, the evening before the murders. It was, on the surface, an ordinary night, heavy with the oppressive humidity of a New England summer. John Morse, the visiting uncle, was staying in the upstairs guest room. He had spent the day and evening in quiet, closed door conversations with Andrew, discussing property, rents, and the management of a farm. The theme, as always, was money. Bridget served dinner. The food was again that same fateful mutton stew, now reheated for the third or fourth day. The summer heat had taken its toll. Abby complained that it tasted sour. Bridget, who had been sick herself, thought the same. But Andrew, incapable of wasting food, insisted nothing was wrong with it and ate it anyway. The meal was consumed in near silence, the only sounds the clink of silverware against porcelain. After dinner, Lizzie and her father exchanged few words. She had been distant with him for days, a coldness that had become her primary tool of communication. Bridget, her stomach still unsettled, went to bed early in her attic room, grateful to escape the tension below. Abby retired soon after, her unease from her visit to the doctor still lingering. Andrew, following his unvarying nightly ritual, locked the doors. He checked the bolt on the front door, the lock on the kitchen door, the hook on the screen. He made his rounds, a sentinel guarding his fortress. Then he pocketed his heavy ring of keys. The house fell silent. In another home, that silence might have meant peace, a gentle end to an ordinary day. Here it was the prelude to something unthinkable. It was the deep, indrawn breath before a scream. No one knew that this would be the last full night the Borden family ever spent together. No one knew that the mundane resentments and petty arguments of the day were about to be immortalized in blood. Thursday, August 4th, 1892. The day began like any other, betraying no hint of the horror it was about to unleash. The morning was warm and still, the air already heavy. Bridget woke first, rising before the sun to begin her duties. She opened the kitchen door, lit the stove, and filled the kettle for tea. Andrew dressed neatly in his usual dark suit despite the heat. He was heading downtown to the bank and to collect his rents, his daily predictable circuit. Lizzie remained upstairs. Later, she would claim that she had not come down for breakfast, but had stayed in her room for a time before moving to the dining room to iron some handkerchiefs alone. John Morse, the uncle, came downstairs and ate breakfast with Andrew and Abby. He planned to leave that morning to visit other relatives, a trip that would provide him with an ironclad alibi. Before leaving, he spoke quietly with Andrew once more. The conversation was polite, matter of fact. At around 9 o'clock, he stepped out of the house and into the street, carrying only a small black bag. He was the last guest to leave the house alive. In less than 2 hours, the quiet, miserable order of this house would be gone forever. In its place would be chaos, confusion, and a mystery that no verdict could ever truly silence. Before the first blow fell, before the first scream that no one ever reported hearing, everything seemed ordinary. Each person was a character playing their part in a familiar, unhappy drama. But inside this house, in its suffocating routines, its locked doors, and its quiet, bitter wars, the final act had already begun. Before tragedy takes root, it always hides in the ordinary. It folds itself into the quiet ritual of breakfast tables, the mindless repetition of daily errands, and the polite, empty spaces in conversations. And if you're not listening closely, if you're not attuned to the dissonance beneath the surface, you'll never hear it coming. This was the Borden household in the days leading up to August 4th, a place of quiet wars, of habit and pride, a family that spoke little and trusted even less. They were a collection of individuals sharing a roof, each nursing their own private grievances, unaware that their small, unhappy world was about to become a stage for a crime that would horrify a nation. Every morning, the Borden home woke in the same immutable way. The first sound was always Bridget's footsteps on the steep, uncarpeted back stairs, a soft thudding that signaled the start of the day's labor. Then came the scrape of an iron lid on the cast iron stove top, the clatter of the coal shuttle, and the faint, sharp hiss of cold water meeting heat in the kettle. Andrew would come down next, deliberate, consistent, his black shoes polished to a dull shine, his expression as unreadable as a stone. Before leaving for his morning walk, he would perform his daily ritual of security. He'd check the locks on every point of entry: the back door, bolted; the side door, locked; the front door, secured with both a spring lock and a deadbolt. Always three turns of the key for the main lock. It was a catechism of caution, a prayer against the outside world. Abby would soon follow, moving quietly from room to room with the slow, heavy gait of a woman burdened by more than just her physical weight. She was the household's caretaker, fluffing pillows, collecting dust with a feather wand, and watching over a house that had never fully welcomed her. Her movements were a silent map of her duties, a constant circling patrol of a territory she managed but did not truly command. Lizzie usually would come down last, not for breakfast with the family. She often skipped it, a small but pointed act of rebellion, but for motion, for presence, for a way to remind the others that she was still there, a silent, watchful force in their shared space. She might be seen reading in the dining room or staring out a window, her mind seemingly miles away. It was a pattern, a domestic ballet performed without joy or affection, one that felt eternal, and within it everyone played their part, locked in a cycle of predictability that was about to be shattered. In the final week of July, something unseen and malevolent spread through the house. They called it food poisoning, a summer complaint. But this was no mild indigestion. It was a violent, prostrating sickness that left each of them pale, weak, and racked with vomiting. Abby, her anxiety already heightened by the household's tensions, worried it was something worse. She confided in the family doctor, Dr. Seabury Bowen, that she believed someone meant them harm. Perhaps it was the mysterious person who had once broken into Andrew's desk. Perhaps it was one of her husband's disgruntled business rivals or a tenant he had dealt with harshly. Andrew, ever the pragmatist, dismissed her fears out of hand. He declared they had simply eaten spoiled mutton or perhaps some bad fish from the market. It was hot, food turned quickly, and it would pass. To him, the idea of poison was a dramatic, feminine fancy. But fear doesn't leave as easily as nausea. It lingers in the back of the mind, coloring every interaction. That week, Abby's visit to Dr. Bowen was not just a casual consultation. She asked him directly if poison could cause stomach pain like hers. The doctor, attempting to be reassuring, told her no, that the symptoms were more consistent with foodborne illness. But even his calm, professional demeanor did not comfort her. She came home and, taking matters into her own hands, began locking the cellar door herself. The cellar was where the icebox was kept, where the food was stored. Her action was a clear, silent statement. She no longer trusted the security of her own home, or perhaps the people in it. In the days that followed, neighbors and friends would later recall a series of strange comments from Lizzie. She seemed to be planting seeds of fear, creating a narrative of an impending threat from an outside source. She spoke often of being uneasy. She told her friend, Alice Russell, that she feared someone was watching the house. She even hinted at a specific danger, that her father had made enemies, and that she felt as if something were hanging over me that I cannot throw off. In a moment of chilling foresight, she told Alice, I am afraid that somebody will do something. No one took her seriously. In the rigid social structure of Fall River, people minded their own business, and women, especially unmarried ones of good standing, were not expected to speak of such dark, violent premonitions. They were expected to trust in the protection of their fathers and husbands and to pray through their anxieties. But Lizzie Borden was not the praying type when she felt wronged. Her piety was a public performance. Her private nature was one of strong will and strategic action. Her warnings, viewed in retrospect, seem less like the ramblings of a nervous woman and more like the calculated groundwork of someone preparing an alibi. She was creating a phantom menace, a nameless, faceless intruder who could be blamed when the unthinkable happened. On August 2nd, just 2 days before the murders, Bridget was washing the outside windows. The day was hot and humid, the air thick and still. She moved from frame to frame, wiping away the city grime, rinsing with a bucket of water, then pausing on her ladder to rest her arm and wipe the sweat from her brow. From her elevated perch, she could see into the ordinary lives of the homes along Second Street, wives calling to one another over fences, children running errands, the iceman making his deliveries. Fall River was alive that week with the mundane rhythms of summer, but inside number 92, the air felt strange, stagnant, like something waiting to break. Bridget didn't know it, but while she worked on one side of the house, Lizzie was on the other, speaking to a neighbor, Mrs. Adelaide Churchill, over the back fence. Lizzie seemed agitated. She mentioned again that she felt unsafe. She said she'd seen a man lurking near the property. She claimed her father had been having trouble, that he had been harsh with some tenants recently and feared retaliation. It sounded like idle talk, the nervous chatter of a daughter worried for her father. But in retrospect, every word would later be examined by investigators like a clue in a puzzle. Lizzie was not just expressing fear, she was actively disseminating a story, creating witnesses to her own manufactured anxiety. On the evening of August 3rd, a guest arrived, adding another layer to the household's complex dynamic. It was John Vinicum Morse, the brother of Andrew's deceased first wife, Sarah. He was, in effect, Lizzie and Emma's biological maternal uncle. He was a quiet, stoic man, a farmer from Iowa who had returned to the area and often stayed with the Bordens when on business. His visit was not purely social. He had come to discuss property matters, specifically the management and potential sale of a farm he co owned with Andrew. His presence meant that the conversation in the house once again revolved around money, assets, and inheritance. The family ate dinner together, that infamous leftover mutton stew. Each ate lightly, each complained of the taste or the heat, and each retired early. John Morse slept in the second floor guest room, the room directly adjacent to Andrew and Abby's master bedroom. The next morning, he would wake, eat a final tense breakfast with his hosts, and leave by 8:45 a.m. to visit other relatives across town. His testimony would later be crucial. He provided a calm, factual record of the previous evening, an account of an ordinary, if slightly uncomfortable, family dinner. He was the last guest to sleep in that house and leave it alive, his departure marking the final closing of the window before the storm. To understand what followed, we must linger for a moment with Lizzie. She was not a one dimensional monster, nor was she an inscrutable mystery. She was a complex and deeply frustrated product of her time, a woman trapped between the rigid expectations of her era and the force of her own desires. In her world, independence for women was a rare and often scandalous notion. Marriage was the expected path. Obedience to one's father and then one's husband was the assumed virtue. Yet Lizzie had her own mind. It was sharp, observant, and strategic. She could be charming and sociable when it suited her, particularly in her church work, but she could also be cold, withdrawn, and silent when she felt slighted. She loved attention when it was on her terms and craved silence when she needed to retreat. To some, she seemed proud and willful. To others, she seemed lonely and misunderstood. Her friends often described her as peculiar, but generally kind, except, they noted, when her stepmother's name came up in conversation. Then her tone would change. It would become cold, controlled, her words clipped. It was a change so noticeable that it seemed almost rehearsed. What did she truly feel in those final days? No one can say for certain. But if the human mind is a house with many rooms, Lizzie's had more locked doors than most. She had a public parlor where she presented her respectable, charitable self to the world, and she had private, hidden chambers where her resentments, her ambitions, and her rage were allowed to fester, unseen and unheard. Only she knew which doors to keep locked, and which ones, on that terrible August morning, she was prepared to open. By the time the gas lamps on Second Street were extinguished and the town lights dimmed, the Borden house was quiet again. A heavy, watchful silence fell over it. Abby was in her room. Andrew, after reading for a time in the sitting room, made his final rounds, checking the locks before retiring. Lizzie was upstairs. Bridget was in her attic room, trying to sleep in the oppressive heat. The sound of a distant church clock striking 10, then 11, then silence, broken only by the house's own nocturnal language of groans and creaks. Outside, the street was empty. A dog barked in the distance, a lonely echoing sound. The iron-shod hooves of a lone horse and carriage clattered briefly on the cobblestones before fading into the night. In the houses nearby, families slept soundly, their doors and windows open to catch any hint of a breeze. No one on Second Street could have guessed what horrors the dawn would bring. No one could have imagined that the quiet, miserly house of Andrew Borden was about to become the site of a massacre. Thursday, August 4th. The day began in a pale, hazy sunlight, a humid glow settling over the waking city. Bridget rose first, her movements heavy with fatigue, to start the breakfast preparations. She boiled water, sliced bread, and muttered softly to herself about her lingering headache. Andrew came down, checked the locks as he always did, and then greeted his house guest, John Morse. They ate a quiet breakfast of Johnny cakes, coffee, and bananas. Abby hovered near the kitchen doorway, her face already flushed from the morning heat. She did not feel well enough to eat. When Morse left at 8:45, the household began to separate into its fatal morning rhythm. Abby climbed the main stairs to the guest room to tidy it after John's stay. Andrew put on his hat and stepped out toward town to conduct his usual business at the bank and collect his rents. Bridget, after cleaning up the breakfast dishes, was instructed by Abby to wash the windows outside, a chore she had started 2 days prior but had not finished. And Lizzie? Lizzie remained, a ghost, in the machine. She moved between rooms, her expression unreadable. She spoke little. She watched, and she waited. She would later tell investigators a series of conflicting stories about her morning, that she'd been in the dining room ironing handkerchiefs, that she'd been reading a magazine in the kitchen, and later, most famously, that she had gone out to the barn to look for a piece of iron to mend a screen. No one saw her there. No one saw much of anything that morning until it was far too late. By mid morning, the Borden home had become unnaturally still, so still that time itself seemed to slow to a crawl. Abby was upstairs, her chores nearly done, her final moments spent in the quiet, dusty guest room. Bridget, after finishing some of the windows, had come back inside, wiping sweat from her forehead and muttering to Lizzie that she felt ill and wanted to lie down for a nap. Andrew returned from town around 10:45 a.m. He was tired. The heat was oppressive. He entered the house, locked the door behind him, and sat down in the sitting room, his place of habit, a newspaper folded beside him on the sofa. He was home. Lizzie appeared briefly, informing him that Abby had supposedly received a note and gone out. It was a simple, devastating lie. She offered him a mild comment about the heat. Nothing remarkable, nothing alarming. A few minutes later, Bridget, resting in her attic room, heard the faint but distinct sound of the city hall clock striking 11. Inside that narrow hall, the air was heavy, hot, and as quiet as a church before a sermon. And then silence took its final, ragged breath. In the minutes that followed, the household clock would keep ticking. The neighbors would go about their errands. The sun would climb higher in the sky. And two lives within a house already divided by greed and resentment would end in a frenzy of violence too brutal to imagine. But that story of the 90 minutes that changed everything belongs to the next part. Fall River, Massachusetts, Thursday morning, August 4th, 1892. The sun had risen pale and heavy, filtered through a hazy curtain of industrial smog and humidity that clung to the mill town like dust. By 7 o'clock, the temperature was already climbing toward 80 degrees. It would be the kind of day that made tempers short and rooms stifling, the kind of oppressive summer heat that seems to slow time itself. Inside the Borden home at 92 Second Street, the air felt just as thick. It was a house too quiet for its size, a house that had long ago learned to hold its breath. Nothing in those first moments, in the shafts of dusty morning light, suggested that history was about to be altered in the most brutal of ways. Bridget Sullivan, the family's maid, was the first to rise. She was 26 years old, an Irish immigrant, and weary from the relentless summer heat. Her small room sat in the attic, directly beneath the dark shingles of the roof. A furnace by mid morning, a stifling box that offered little rest. She came down the narrow, steep back stairs just after 6 o'clock. The clock in the sitting room struck the hour with a metallic chime as she opened the kitchen windows, hoping for a breeze that never came. On the cast iron stove, she reheated the mutton broth left over from yesterday's dinner. It was all that remained of the family's last meager meal: boiled mutton, soup, and bread. They had been eating some version of this same mutton for days, and by now it filled the small kitchen with a sour, greasy smell that hung heavy in the humid air. She set the dining room table for three: Mr. and Mrs. Borden and John Morse, the guest who had arrived unexpectedly the night before. Bridget herself was still feeling the effects of the mysterious illness that had swept through the household. A lingering nausea and a dull headache made her movements heavy. The day's labor already felt like an insurmountable task. John Vinicum Morse was Abby Borden's brother in law, the brother of Andrew's deceased first wife, Sarah. He was a quiet, practical man with a farmer's posture and a habit of visiting when business suited him. He was not family in the warm, familiar sense. His presence was more transactional, a reminder of the complex web of property and finance that bound the Bordens together. He had slept in the upstairs guest room, the room that would, before the morning ended, become the first crime scene, its floral carpet soaked with blood. At breakfast, conversation was sparse, a collection of disconnected statements rather than a flowing dialogue. Andrew Borden, as was his custom, read the Fall River Daily Herald, his face hidden behind the broadsheet paper. Abby spoke briefly about errands that needed to be run, and John Morse, a quiet observer, ate his meal and drank his coffee. Lizzie wasn't there. She rarely ate with them anymore, her absence a familiar, silent protest. John Morse mentioned his plans for the day. He would visit his niece in another part of Fall River and then travel to see relatives in the nearby town of Swansea. He planned to take the 8:45 a.m. train. He told Andrew he would likely return later in the afternoon, perhaps around noon. The talk was ordinary, the tone polite but stiff. In this house, affection was a carefully measured commodity, and silence was often mistaken for a form of peace. After finishing his coffee, he politely thanked Abby, retrieved his small bag, and walked to the front door. The clock read a quarter to 9. The door shut behind him with a soft, final click, an ordinary sound that would soon haunt everyone who heard it. He was the last outsider to see the family in its state of tense, fragile normalcy. The Borden home was a two-story structure with an attic and a cellar built in the plain, symmetrical Greek Revival style. From the street, it looked respectable but unremarkable. But inside, it was a labyrinth of strange divisions and psychological barricades. Andrew Borden, out of a combination of extreme thrift and stubborn pride, had never modernized the home. There was no running water or proper bathroom on the upper floors. The family used chamber pots and a privy located in the backyard. There was no gas lighting, only dim, flickering kerosene lamps. And he had staunchly refused to move the family to the fashionable Hill District, where Fall River's wealthier citizens resided in grand, airy Victorian mansions. The result was a house filled with small, potent resentments. The layout itself bred conflict. To get from one room to another often required passing through someone else's private space. Emma and Lizzie occupied the rooms at the front of the second floor. Andrew and Abby kept to the back. Doors were locked not just out of a fear of intruders, but out of habit, and perhaps a deep seated desire for avoidance. Each space had its owner, each threshold its invisible boundaries. Even Bridget's access was limited. She cleaned what she was told to clean and entered rooms only when she was asked. She would later say she sometimes felt like a ghost in the house, present but invisible, her labor essential, but her humanity ignored. The house was not a home, it was a collection of territories, each one jealously guarded. Andrew Jackson Borden, 70 years old, was a man of rigid, unvarying routine. He was already known as one of the wealthiest men in Fall River, yet he moved through the world with the cautious frugality of a man perpetually on the edge of poverty. Around 9 o'clock, having finished his breakfast and seen his guest off, he put on his hat and began his daily walk to his business offices downtown. He dressed in a dark wool suit, an inexplicable choice for the oppressive heat, but a uniform he never abandoned. His stride was slow, deliberate. Neighbors would later recall seeing him that morning, tipping his hat to a passerby, his expression as unreadable as ever. He stopped at the post office first. Then he walked to the Union Savings Bank, where he served as president. He had a brief conversation with the cashier. He then stopped at a nearby store to collect a key from a tenant. His movements were a map of his financial interests, a tour of the assets he so carefully guarded. By a little after 10 o'clock, he was heading back home. The walk was short, but the sun had grown merciless. By the time he reached the front steps of 92 Second Street again, sweat darkened the back of his collar, and his face was likely flushed from the exertion. He was a man returning to the cool stillness of his own home for a moment of rest. Back at the house, Abby Borden had begun her own morning chores. She was a stout woman in her mid-60s, with the cautious, watchful grace of someone long accustomed to navigating a tense environment. After supervising the breakfast cleanup, she tidied the dining room first, then began the slow climb up the narrow front stairs. Her destination was the guest bedroom. Her task was simple: to make up the bed where John Morse had slept. On her way, she paused by the hall mirror, straightened her collar, and carried a freshly folded pillowcase under one arm. It was the last ordinary act of her life. Downstairs, Bridget had just finished washing the breakfast dishes. It was at this moment that Lizzie entered the kitchen briefly. She stood in the doorway, a quiet figure, and asked Bridget if Mrs. Borden had gone out. Bridget replied that she didn't know, but that she thought she had gone upstairs. That small, seemingly insignificant exchange, a simple question about Abby's whereabouts, would later become the hinge on which the entire case turned. It was the first instance of Lizzie establishing a narrative in which her stepmother's location was unknown. Lizzie Andrew Borden, 32 years old, was described by her neighbors as polite, quiet, and occasionally withdrawn. But beneath that placid exterior was a will of iron and a deep well of frustration. That morning, she wore a simple light blue house dress. She had complained of feeling unwell, telling her friend Alice Russell the day before that she might stay home instead of joining her for an outing. In her later contradictory testimony, Lizzie would claim she went out into the backyard barn around 9:30 to look for lead sinkers for a fishing trip. It was a flimsy excuse, no such trip was planned, and the barn loft on a sweltering August morning would have been a suffocating blanket of trapped air, dust motes dancing in the slivers of light. She said she stayed there for about 20 minutes, eating pears from a basket she found, before returning to the house. No one saw her enter the barn. No one saw her leave. Bridget, meanwhile, had been sent outside again. Abby, just before going upstairs, had instructed her to wash the outside windows, a task she resented in the growing heat. From her position in the yard, she had a clear view of the barn. She would later testify that she heard no sounds from within it during that time. When Bridget looked back on that morning, she remembered one detail vividly: the profound stillness of the house. From outside, she heard not a footstep, not a whisper, only the high, droning hum of cicadas in the trees and the faint, rhythmic tick of the parlor clock, just audible through an open window. By 10 o'clock, the day had turned blindingly bright. The street outside shimmered with a heat that rose in visible waves from the cobblestones. Carriages moved slowly, their horses stamping irritably at flies. Inside the Borden home, a different kind of stillness had taken hold. Abby remained upstairs, unheard and unseen. Andrew had not yet returned from his errands, and Bridget was finishing her work in the yard. Lizzie moved quietly through the ground floor rooms. She would later claim that after her supposed trip to the barn, she took an ironing board from the dining room closet and set it up near the kitchen stove to press some handkerchiefs. The air inside the house was thick with the lingering smells of soap, the sour old meat from breakfast, and perhaps something else, something sharp and metallic, a scent no one remarked on at the time. At about 10:40, Andrew returned home. He tried his key in the front door, but found it bolted from the inside. He knocked gently. Bridget, having just come inside from the yard, heard the knock and went to the door. She fumbled with the stiff, complex bolt. As she struggled, she heard a faint sound from the top of the stairs, a sound she would later describe as a snicker or a laugh. It was Lizzie. Bridget finally opened the door. Andrew stepped inside, complaining of the heat and his lingering illness. Bridget asked if he needed anything. He told her no, only to close the door tight behind him. She did, and then, feeling unwell herself, she went up the back stairs to her attic room to rest. What happened in the next 20 minutes remains one of the most contested and chilling mysteries in the annals of American crime. The house fell silent again. Lizzie later claimed she helped her father, who was feeling faint, to settle on the sitting room sofa. She said she helped him remove his boots and covered him with a small afghan. Then, in one of her most inexplicable claims, she said she went to the barn once more, this time searching for a piece of iron to fix a screen. But outside, there were no witnesses to this second trip. And inside, the only other conscious person, Bridget, heard nothing from her attic room except the faint murmur of Lizzie's voice speaking to her father and the persistent droning hum of the August insects. It was nearly 11 o'clock. The city hall clock was about to strike the hour. The day's order, however strained, still seemed intact. No scream had been heard. No alarm had been raised. No hint had been given of the horror that had already taken place upstairs or of the second act that was about to unfold. Within minutes, the fragile balance of that quiet house would shatter forever. It was almost 11 o'clock. The heat of the day pressed against the window glass like a steady, invisible hand. In houses like this, built with thick walls and narrow hallways, sound travels in odd and unpredictable ways, muffled on heavy carpets, clearer on bare wooden stairs, and nearly lost behind the solid weight of a closed door. On this morning, sound would matter, but so too would silence. Upstairs, Abby Borden lay in the guest room, her morning chores forever unfinished. Downstairs, Andrew Borden had just come in from his errands, his body settling its weight onto the sitting room settee. In the attic, Bridget Sullivan, the maid, had returned from her outdoor chores and wanted only a brief, feverish rest. And Lizzie, the daughter, moved through the center of the house, unhurried, composed, doing small things in small rooms as if none of them yet knew what the day had irrevocably chosen for them. The guest room held the traces of a visitor, John Morse, who had slept there the night before. It was a room frozen in a state of mid morning domesticity. The sheets had been straightened, the pillowcases changed. It was the routine choreography of tidying, an act performed countless times in countless homes. A small, white counterpane lay neatly folded at the foot of the bed. A hairbrush, its bristles clean, glinted faintly on the washstand. On the floor, just beyond the edge of the bed, where the room narrows into a tight corridor of shadow, lay the body of Abby Borden. She lay face down, her arms slightly outstretched, as if reaching for the edge of the bed she had just been making. The scene was one of contained, almost clinical violence. There was no overturned furniture, no burst of scattered objects from a frantic struggle. The room itself was undisturbed. Only the body and the dark, spreading stain on the floral carpet spoke of the horror that had occurred. The house below her was quiet enough to hear a hinge settle. No footsteps on the back stairs, no voices from the kitchen, only that slow, metronomic clock in the sitting room, tick, 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 measuring time without judgment, oblivious to the fact that for one person in the house, time had already stopped. We do not know if Abby heard anyone enter the room. The thick carpet would have muffled any footfalls. We do not know if she turned at the last second. We know only this. Sometime near 10 o'clock, as she bent slightly at the waist to straighten the coverlet, the first blow landed from behind. It was sudden, precise, and unmercifully violent. It ended thought before thought could fully form. The subsequent blows followed with a chilling regularity, methodical, contained, and delivered with a fury that was entirely personal. Now, an hour later, the guest room kept its terrible secret. The house inhaled and did not exhale. Downstairs, the clock continued its indifferent work, and the living moved around the dead, separated only by a flight of stairs and a thin wooden floor. At approximately 10:45, Andrew Borden returned. He walked up the three granite steps to his front door and found it resistant. The door was secured with three bolts from the inside, a spring latch at the top, a deadbolt in the middle, and a third bolt at the bottom. It was a fortress. He jiggled his key, felt it snag on the unyielding mechanism, and rattled the knob with a growing impatience born of heat and fatigue. He knocked. Bridget, who had just come in from her window washing and was starting up the back stairs to her attic room, heard the noise. She came down again, moving quickly through the kitchen and dining room, perhaps muttering an apology through the thick wood of the door. The locks were notoriously stiff. After an awkward moment of fumbling, the bolts finally gave way. Andrew stepped inside, steadying himself for a moment with a hand on the newel post at the bottom of the main staircase. He removed his hat. The hallway air felt stale and motionless, as if the house had been holding its breath since he left that morning. Upstairs, in the silent guest room, Abby did not answer the door's complaint. She would not answer anything again. Andrew Borden had walked back into a home that was no longer his own. It was now a tomb, and he did not yet know it. Andrew lowered himself onto the horsehair settee, the small sofa near the parlor door where he often rested after his morning walks. He set his hat aside on the dining room table, tugged once at the stiff collar of his shirt, and exhaled. For a man of 70, in the oppressive heat of August, rest was not a luxury, but a necessity. Lizzie appeared at the doorway between the dining room and the sitting room. Her tone, as Bridget would later recall, was level and conversational. She informed her father that Abby had received a note from a sick friend and had gone out. It was a simple, plausible lie. No one would ever find such a note. No sick friend would ever step forward to claim it. But in that moment, it served its purpose. It explained Abby's absence. Andrew seemed satisfied by the explanation, or perhaps he was simply too tired and unwell to question it. He leaned his head back against the arm of the settee, his eyes closed. The small folded afghan lying near the arm of the sofa brushed against his sleeve. Bridget, having let Mr. Borden in, reappeared and asked whether he wanted anything more. Tea, perhaps. He declined. His final words to her were a simple instruction to close the door well. Bridget's footsteps receded toward the back of the house, up the steep, narrow stairs leading to her attic refuge. Above them, on the second floor, Abby lay in the same quiet, broken posture, unseen and unspoken for. For a brief, suspended moment, the house achieved a kind of stillness that can exist only between two terrible events, the first one completed and concealed, the second not yet begun. In her later statements, Lizzie would place herself in a series of brief, practical, and entirely unremarkable tasks. She had ironed handkerchiefs in the dining room earlier, she said. Now she might go to the barn to find a bit of iron to mend a broken screen. Nothing dramatic, nothing suspicious, just small, ordinary errands threaded through the quiet rooms of a small, ordinary house. Whether she actually walked to the barn then, or whether she simply remembered it that way later, is a question that lives forever in the space between dust and light. The police investigators who later examined the barn loft noted that the thick layer of dust on the floor showed no clear footprints. The heat that day was punishing. The inside air of the barn pressed down like a heavy, suffocating blanket. It was not a place where anyone would linger for comfort or for a task that could wait. But we keep to what can be said without speculation. If she went, no one saw her. If she stayed, no one heard her. The house kept its secrets well. Sometime close to 11 o'clock, as the city hall bell prepared to strike the hour, the stillness in the sitting room changed. Andrew Borden sat with his eyes closed, not fully asleep, but in that drowsy, vulnerable state between wakefulness and slumber. He was simply relieved to be off his feet, the morning's errands done. The room's light was filtered and dim, the heavy half curtains drawn against the street's glare. A newspaper lay folded, its edges perfectly squared, on the small table beside him. The first strike came from the left above his Erline. It was delivered with a horrifying, decisive force. It was exact. It allowed no time for a cry, no time for defense, no time for the second. The instrument, whether a hatchet or a hand axe, performed its work with a grim certainty. No struggle disturbed the room. No furniture scraped against the floor. Nothing in the settee's placement suggested a sudden clash or a desperate fight. The act was contained by the house the way a thought is contained by a mind, tightly, invisibly, absolutely. It was an execution. By the time the final blow fell, silence had returned in full, heavier now, thicker, as if weighted by the terrible knowledge it carried. Bridget Sullivan, the only other living soul in the building who was not on the first floor, had climbed the back stairs to her attic room. She lay down on her bed. Her head throbbed in the oppressive heat. Her stomach, unsettled all week, turned again. She closed her eyes, seeking a few moments of oblivion before the afternoon's chores would begin. Down the stairwell, there was no scuffle to hear, no shout, no sound of alarm, only the faint ambient architecture of the house, the occasional settling of its old timber, a faint gust of wind passing by the rear entry, and the clock, always the clock. The minutes inched forward without incident. Bridget did not know that the rigid, unhappy order she relied on for her survival had already disappeared. She did not know that she was resting in a house of the dead. Lizzie's explanation, that Abby had been called out by a note to attend a sick friend, now hung in careful, deliberate balance with a simple, brutal fact. Abby had not left the house. She lay just 20 steps away, up the narrow front staircase, in a room the family rarely entered without purpose. This is where the house itself does its quiet, complicit work. Doors that close and latch, corridors that bend and break sightlines, a layout that offers a resident a map of concealment that an intruder would never know. The Borden home was tidy and predictable, but its geography was an accomplice. Andrew on the settee, Abby in the guest room, Bridget in the attic, and Lizzie moving between rooms, between errands, between statements that would soon be weighed like gold coins by a jury. The house returned to stillness, not because nothing had happened, but because everything had. What finally broke the quiet was not a scream of terror. It was a call, a clear, composed instruction, cutting the thick air with purpose rather than shock. Bridget, disoriented by the heat and a light doze, sat up on her bed. She registered the name, Maggie, the household's careless habit of calling current maids by the name of the one before, and the note of urgency beneath the calm. Bridget's feet hit the floor. She moved down the attic stairs, one hand on the railing, her heart beginning to pound. She turned at the bottom of the stairs, passed through the kitchen, and moved toward the sitting room. There, at the threshold, the predictable order of her world ended. Andrew Borden did not stir from the settee. The room around him had not been overturned by a struggle. Bridget did not cross the threshold. She stopped, steadied her trembling body against the doorframe, and looked away, unable to process the horrifying tableau before her. Lizzie stood near the doorway to the dining room, her face pale, but by all accounts eerily composed. Her voice was level when she spoke the words that would begin the next chapter of the nightmare. Go and get the doctor. Run. Father's dead. Somebody came in and killed him. There was no elaborate explanation, only an instruction, the next logical step in a sequence only she understood. For a handful of seconds, Bridget did not move. The etiquette of tragedy, the human instinct to rush forward and help, warring with the servant's ingrained counter instinct to back away and not intrude, held her paralyzed in the doorway. Lizzie did not cross the room either. She stood at a distance, the choreography of her shock and control continuing exactly as it had begun, quiet, precise, and unadorned by hysterics. Then motion resumed. Bridget, spurred by the instruction, turned and ran. A bucket near the back entry. A door opened to the blinding heat and daylight. Her footsteps pounding onto the steps, then across the yard and toward the neighbor's house where Dr. Bowen lived. But for one final suspended moment before the world flooded in, before neighbors arrived with their horror and their questions, before the doctor came with his black bag, before uniforms and notebooks and paper wrapped evidence began to catalog the carnage, the Borden house existed as two places at once: a home where a father had set down his hat to rest, and a crime scene where nothing in its tidy, frugal order could ever be trusted again. Inside, upstairs, Abby had not been called out by a note and could not be called back by any voice. Downstairs, Andrew's morning had ended where it began, at the center of his own careful locked house, surrounded by the thrift he believed would keep him safe. The profound bloody silence between those two rooms was the last secret the family ever truly shared. In a moment, the house will fill with feet and voices and questions, but that belongs to the next section. For now, the morning ends here. With Bridget running for help, Lizzie composed in the doorway, Andrew at rest, and a terrible secret 20 steps above, still untouched by any eyes. By 11:15, the suffocating silence that had sealed the Borden house began to tear at the seams. The world outside, the rhythmic clatter of carriages, the murmur of neighbors on their porches, the passing noon trade, did not yet know what had happened within those drab olive walls. But in a city like Fall River, built on close quarters and shared lives, sound travels quickly and rumor travels faster. The first to hear was Adelaide Churchill, the neighbor from across the street. She saw Bridget Sullivan run from the Bordens' back door, her face a mask of pale shock, her hands twisting in her apron. Then came Dr. Seabury Bowen, summoned from his home just across the way. By the time Bridget reached the back step, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps, the quiet street had started to lean toward number 92, drawn by that invisible, irresistible force of tragedy. Mrs. Churchill was the first to enter, her voice filled with a neighborly concern that was about to curdle into horror. Lizzie stood in the dining room, her posture straight, her face pale but composed. Her reply was not a cry, but a statement of fact. Simple words, no wailing, no hysteria, just the dead weight of a fact laid out as flat and neat as a piece of linen on an ironing table. Dr. Bowen crossed the street at once, hatless in the blistering sun, his black leather bag swinging at his side. The oppressive heat hit him before the odor did. He stepped into the sitting room, took one look at the figure on the settee, and did not touch the body. His medical training and his human instinct collided. He would later testify that he saw a man, his face hacked beyond recognition, lying in a pool of blood that was still bright and wet. He knew instantly that death had been recent and brutally violent. Dr. Bowen turned from the horrific sight, steadied himself, and began the simple, grim ritual of confirmation. He felt for a pulse at the wrist, knowing he would find none. He noted the catastrophic injuries to the head. He then gently covered the ruined face with a small towel and turned his attention to Lizzie. She was composed, he would say later, eerily so. Her face was pale, but she was not fainting, not weeping. He asked her what had happened. She repeated her story. Her father had come home. She had helped him to the sofa, and she had then gone out to the barn. When she returned, she found him like this. She told him her stepmother, Abby, had received a note and had gone out to visit a sick friend. Dr. Bowen nodded, uncertain. He asked where Bridget was. Bridget stood near the kitchen doorway, her hands clenched in her apron, her eyes fixed on the floor, unable to look toward the sitting room. The thought, spoken aloud by a neighbor, passed through the room like a chill. If Abby had come home, where was she now? The lie about the note had created a pocket of ignorance, but now, with the reality of murder filling the house, every absence became suspicious. Dr. Bowen, his voice echoing in the unnaturally quiet hallway, called up the main stairwell, "Mrs. Borden, Abby!" No answer. The air above was still and heavy. Adelaide Churchill, unable to bear the waiting, moved toward the grand central staircase. Behind her, another neighbor, Alice Russell, who had just arrived, followed halfway up, her hand on the polished banister. At the top of the landing, where the guest room door stood partially open, Mrs. Churchill's gaze was drawn into the room. She glanced toward the bed and saw what looked like a dark bundle, something fallen beside it, a shape that did not belong in the tidy, sunlit room. She froze. Her mind struggled to process what her eyes were seeing. Then she turned her head away, her hand flying to her mouth. Her voice, when it came, was a faint, shaky whisper that barely carried down the stairs. It was Abby Borden. She lay face down just beyond the bed's far edge, in the narrow space between the bed and the wall. The back of her head was a mass of dark, coagulated blood. The air in the room was already heavy and strange, thick with the metallic scent of death that had been sitting undisturbed for more than an hour. The discovery of the second body transformed the scene. This was no longer a single targeted attack on Andrew Borden. This was a massacre. Downstairs, Dr. Bowen, his face grim, dispatched a neighbor with an urgent command: fetch the police marshal immediately. City Marshal Rufus B. Hilliard and Officer George Allen were among the first to reach the house, followed within minutes by several other officers, including Officer Michael Mullally. They found a scene of controlled chaos. Lizzie was in the kitchen, sitting calmly. Bridget was pale and trembling, being tended to by a neighbor, and Dr. Bowen was moving between rooms with the forced precision of a man trying to impose order on the unthinkable. The officers took in the scene with the cautious slowness of men who know that every object, every speck of dust, every misplaced item might later be called upon to testify. The sitting room, orderly, except for the horror on the settee. The dining room, an ironing board set up, a few handkerchiefs neatly folded. The kitchen, clean and tidy. The parlor, untouched, its furniture still shrouded. The air throughout the house was thick with something that did not belong to domestic life. They noted the key facts immediately. No signs of forced entry. The doors had been locked from the inside. There were no muddy footprints in the dust of the yard or on the steps. There was no evidence of a robbery. Andrew Borden's gold watch and chain were still in his waistcoat pocket, and money was still in his trousers. In the cellar, an officer conducting a search found a collection of axes and hatchets resting on a dusty shelf among other tools. One stood out. It was a hatchet head, its wooden handle cleanly broken off near the blade. Its edge was dusty, as if it had been freshly and deliberately rubbed with ash from the cellar stove. The ash might have been a crude attempt to clean the blade, or it might have been placed there to conceal something else entirely. The officer, sensing its potential significance, wrapped it carefully. This handleless hatchet head would become one of the most famous and fiercely debated pieces of evidence in American legal history. If there was one detail that unsettled the experienced officers most, it was not the sheer violence of the murders. It was the pristine, almost impossible absence of any trace of that violence on the living. The killer had wielded a weapon with enough force to crush two human skulls, an act that would have produced a fine, atomized spray of blood. Yet there was no blood on Lizzie's dress. There were no stains in the kitchen sink, in the water basin, on the towels, or on the handle of the backyard water pump. Even the floorboards seemed innocent of what they had borne. The August heat might dry blood quickly, but it would not make it vanish. They marked it as profoundly peculiar. Marshal Hilliard asked Lizzie for her account of the morning. She repeated the same sequence of events she had given to Dr. Bowen and the neighbors. She had been in the barn, she heard a groaning noise, she came inside, she found her father. Her voice, the marshal noted, did not waver. He pressed her. Her words were reasonable. They offered a plausible, if vague, alternative suspect, but her calm was not. It was a cold, unnerving placidity in the face of absolute carnage. By noon, the Borden house had ceased to be a private residence. It had become a public stage, a maze of overlapping voices and conflicting purposes. Neighbors, driven by a mixture of horror and morbid curiosity, moved in and out with basins of water, towels, and palm leaf fans to stir the suffocating air. Constables, trying to maintain control, searched trunks, tested doors, and checked windows for pry marks, finding none. Lizzie sat in the kitchen with Alice Russell, a family friend who had hurried over the moment she heard the terrible news. Alice put a comforting hand on Lizzie's shoulder. Lizzie did not weep. She only said, her voice low and steady, "Alice, I think someone must have wanted father's money." Outside, the word had spread through the town like a contagion. By 1 o'clock, a crowd of hundreds had gathered on Second Street, pressing against the white picket fence for a glimpse of the house, of the officials, of anything related to the horror within. Inside, the officers worked with a growing discomfort they could not quite name. Every surface in that house was too clean, too deliberate. A crime so violent, so frenzied, should have left a storm of disorder in its wake. Instead, it had left a strange and unsettling symmetry. The officers spoke quietly among themselves, out of earshot of the family and neighbors. Their logic was simple and brutal. A stranger could not have entered and escaped unseen, not by the front, which was locked, and not by the back, which was in view of Bridget in the yard. Every bolt and lock had been in place. The murders had been an inside job. That left only those known to be in the house that morning: Andrew, Abby, Bridget, and Lizzie. Andrew was dead. Abby, the medical examiner would soon confirm, had died first by at least an hour. Bridget had a plausible alibi. She was either outside washing windows or resting in her attic room, physically separated from the scenes of the crimes, which left one. They did not say her name aloud, not yet. To accuse a woman of her standing, a church going, respectable spinster, of parricide was a monumental leap. But in their notebooks and in their minds, each man drew a quiet, inescapable circle around the same name. By 2 o'clock, the bodies had been respectfully covered, and the afternoon heat began to settle again like a second weight, making the grim work of the investigation even more unbearable. Reporters from the Fall River Herald and other local papers had arrived, notebooks in hand, their eyes bright with a mixture of professional duty and macabre excitement. The Borden name would draw headlines across the country. Inside, Dr. William Dolan, the medical examiner, made his first brief official examination. He noted the multiple crushing and incised wounds, the direction of the blows, the depth and angle of the cuts. The evidence suggested the assailant had been standing over the victims, striking downward with immense force. The height difference and the contained nature of the attacks indicated someone of medium stature, not a tall, broad shouldered man. The implication hung unspoken in the warm, heavy air. Meanwhile, Dr. Bowen, concerned for Lizzie's state, gave her a small dose of morphine for her nerves. He meant it as an act of comfort, a way to soothe the shock. But that single dose would later cloud every answer she gave to investigators, making her testimony seem even more evasive and contradictory. The afternoon stretched long, the rooms filled with that peculiar, unforgettable scent, a mixture of iron, sweat, soap, and something unnameable and sweet. Neighbors whispered, the police whispered louder. Each corner of the house began to carry its own specific gravity. The guest room upstairs, a place of hidden, cold brutality. The sitting room down, the site of a swift, shocking execution, and the kitchen, where Lizzie sat perfectly still at the center of it all. The officers would later recall how she watched them as they worked, her eyes level, her speech polite, her hands folded calmly in her lap. When asked by Marshal Hilliard if she wanted to see her stepmother's body, she replied softly, without a trace of emotion, "She is not my mother, sir. She is my stepmother. My mother is dead." When pressed again, she simply said, "I am not strong enough to see her now." No tears, no tremor, only a chilling, unbreachable calm. Before leaving for the day, one of the constables returned to the cool, damp darkness of the cellar. He lifted the broken handled hatchet head again. The blade edge, though covered in a fine gray dust, seemed sharper beneath the ash, cleaner near its deadly curve than the rest of the rusted tool. He looked toward the stairs, where a pale stripe of sunlight cut through the dust filled air, and said quietly, to no one in particular, "If this isn't it, it's kin to it." He sealed the hatchet head in brown paper. The single most important piece of physical evidence in the case, the object that would define the next year of Lizzie Borden's life, sat for a moment, an ordinary brown parcel, at his feet on the damp cellar floor. By evening, the crowd outside on Second Street had grown so thick that the police had to form a line to keep them back. People were no longer whispering. They were speaking Lizzie's name in full, as if its very syllables were a spell, a condemnation. Lizzie Borden. Inside, lamps were being lit. The rooms glowed with a sickly yellow light, casting long, distorted shadows along the floorboards. Dr. Bowen advised that Lizzie should have someone stay with her through the night. Rest, he said, was essential. But no one in Fall River would sleep easily that night. The Borden house, once a private symbol of thrift and discipline, had become a public stage, and every object within it, a locked door, a blue dress, a handleless hatchet, had now taken on its role in the unfolding drama. The law had entered the house, but the truth had not yet spoken. That would come next, slowly, painfully, and under the disorienting haze of morphine. When the last officer left that evening, the house closed in on itself once more. The lamps burned low, the beds went unused, and upstairs, the guest room held a dark, profound silence that no one in the house dared to break. Night fell heavy over Fall River. The oppressive heat of the day lingered, trapping the city's breath. At 92 Second Street, the Borden house was no longer a home, but an exhibit, watched by the curious, guarded by the law, and whispered about by an entire town. Inside, shadows shifted against the floral wallpaper as kerosene lanterns burned low, their yellow light failing to dispel the gloom. The sharp, clean scent of disinfectant battled with something older and more persistent that could not be scrubbed away. Downstairs in the dining room, Lizzie Borden sat. Dr. Bowen, the family physician, remained beside her, a figure of professional concern. Her father's favorite chair in the sitting room had been moved aside, a piece of evidence in itself. In its place, a constable kept quiet, watchful vigil. Lizzie's face was pale, a mask of exhaustion, but her voice, when she spoke, was unnervingly steady. Outside, the crowd that had gathered during the day thinned but did not disappear. They lingered past midnight, small groups of men and women clustered under the gaslights, waiting for any sign of an arrest, any resolution to the day's horror. Some believed she was innocent, a victim of circumstance, too refined, too gentle for such a brutal act. Others whispered that her composure was not a sign of innocence, but of cold, calculating control. The old house creaked under the new and unfamiliar weight of public speculation. Shortly after 11 o'clock, City Marshal Rufus Hilliard returned to the house to take a more formal statement from Lizzie. The initial shock had passed, and now the machinery of the law was beginning its slow, methodical work. Dr. Bowen remained close by her side, his presence serving as both physician and protector. He noted that Lizzie's pulse was erratic, a physical betrayal of the calm she projected. To quiet her nerves, he administered a small dose of morphine, a common sedative of the era, but one that would have profound consequences. It was enough to fog the edges of thought, to blur the line between memory and invention. The questions began gently, delivered in the calm, professional tone of a man seeking clarity, a man's calm voice. Miss Borden, can you tell us again where you were when your father came home? Lizzie's reply was soft, her voice articulate but laced with a faint, drifting quality. I think I was in the barn, looking for iron, or perhaps it was lead, for sinkers for a fishing trip. The detail was specific yet vague, an item for a purpose, but the item itself was uncertain. Man's voice. And did you see anyone while you were there? Lizzie's voice. No, no one. I heard a groan, or was it a scraping sound? I don't know. I came in because I felt the screen door was hard to open. Then I came in, and father was. She did not finish the sentence. Her words drifted like mist, half remembered, half rearranged, each phrase an island in a sea of uncertainty. The officers noted the contradictions. Earlier that day, in the first chaos of the discovery, she had said she'd been in the barn for 15 minutes. Now she thought it might have been 20 or longer. She had initially said she heard nothing, but now she mentioned a groan or a scraping sound. Each answer seemed to correct the last, and each correction birthed another, small inconsistency. The story was fluid. changing its shape even as it was being told. The morphine, intended to soothe, instead acted as a veil. It blurred the sharp edges between truth and protection, between what she remembered and what she thought she ought to remember. She repeated herself, sometimes twice in a row, sometimes with slight but significant differences. Her eyes would drift toward the parlor door, as if expecting her father to walk through, an act of subconscious denial at war with the grim reality of the situation. When asked again about her stepmother, her story remained fixed on one crucial, unprovable detail: Lizzie's voice. Mrs. Borden was out. She had received a note. Someone was sick. The officers exchanged glances. No note had been found. No messenger had been seen delivering one. In their canvassing of the neighborhood, no sick friend had been identified. It was not yet proof of guilt, but it was a fracture in her narrative, a crack that the investigation began to press through. It was a story that could not be corroborated. They asked her gently about her relationship with Abby. Her reply was quiet, delivered with a chilling precision. Lizzie's voice, distant and cool. She is my stepmother. My mother died when I was a child. I sometimes call her mother, but she is not my mother. That small sentence, soft as a breath, carried the weight of 30 years of bitterness. It was a correction, a clarification made in the midst of a murder investigation, a moment where social accuracy seemed as important to her as the facts of the crime. Marshall Hilliard wrote it down exactly as it was spoken, as morning came slow and unwelcome. The air was dull and gray, heavy with the promise of more heat. Inside the Borden house, breakfast was prepared but went untouched. A strange, formal quiet had descended. Reporters had camped outside on the street all night, their presence a constant, hungry pressure. Marshall Hilliard returned again that morning, this time accompanied by the formidable district attorney, Hosea Knowlton. Knowlton was a shrewd, experienced prosecutor, and his presence signaled a significant escalation. They spoke with Lizzie in the sitting room, the very room where her father's body had lain just hours before. Her friend Alice Russell stayed nearby, a silent, supportive presence. Lizzie wore the same simple dress as the day before, a blue cotton print, modest and unremarkable. She sat upright in her chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, answering their questions in short, clear phrases. The morphine from the night before had worn off, but her composure remained intact. They asked again about her time in the barn. She repeated the story about looking for lead for sinkers. They asked if she had eaten that morning. She said no, she had felt sick. They asked if she had heard her stepmother's voice at any point that morning. She said quietly, "No, sir, not since she told me she was going out." Her account was all neat, tidy, and self contained, and yet no physical evidence, not a single corroborating witness, could be found to support any of it. Her alibi existed only in her own words. 3 days after the murders, on a quiet Sunday morning, the most ordinary of household acts became the most suspicious. The house was still heavy with heat and scrutiny. Neighbors whispered from their porches, their eyes fixed on the house. Inside, Lizzie, along with her sister Emma, who had returned to Fall River upon hearing the news, was in the kitchen with their friend Alice Russell. Alice watched as Lizzie took a folded blue cotton Bedford cord dress, the same style she was said to have worn on the day of the murders, and walked deliberately to the kitchen stove. Without a word, she began tearing the dress and placing the pieces, one by one, into the stove's fiery mouth. Alice, horrified, immediately understood the implication. Alice's voice, quiet and uneasy. "Lizzie, what are you doing?" Lizzie turned, her expression calm, almost casual. Lizzie's voice, matter of fact. "I am going to burn this old thing. It is covered with paint." Alice Russell said nothing more, but the image was seared into her memory. She knew that destroying a potential piece of evidence, especially in full view of a witness, was an act of either profound innocence or astonishing arrogance. Later, when questioned by police, she would recount every word, every gesture. To the officers, Lizzie's excuse sounded hollow. It was less like housekeeping and more like the systematic erasure of a terrible secret. The ashes of that dress would follow Lizzie Borden all the way to her trial, a silent, incriminating ghost she could not bury. By the start of that week, Fall River had become a stage for rampant rumor and public trial. The Fall River Globe, seizing on the police's growing suspicion, printed a headline that read, "Miss Lizzie under suspicion." Within hours, her name filled the front pages of newspapers in Boston, New York, and beyond. Each retelling of the story grew larger, more dramatic. The narrative split into two opposing myths. In one, she was the pious daughter, unjustly accused, a gentlewoman framed for a crime she was too refined to commit. In the other, she was a cold blooded heiress, a calculating monster who had dispatched her parents with chilling composure and was now using her social standing as a shield. Each paper wrote its own version, each neighbor whispered theirs. The once private household now existed under public ownership. Reporters with stopwatches and tape measures timed the walk from the sitting room to the barn. They calculated how many feet separated the guest bed from the spot where Abby's body had fallen. Every inch of the house was measured, except for the vast, unknowable distance between who Lizzie Borden truly was and who the world believed she must be. A week after the murders, on August 11th, the inevitable arrived. After a formal inquest where her testimony was deemed contradictory and evasive, Lizzie Borden was placed under formal arrest for the murders of her father and stepmother. The marshal read the charge to her in the quiet of her own bedroom. She stood and listened without interruption, her hands clasped in front of her. When he finished, her only reply was a quiet question. Lizzie's voice, faint but clear. "Is there no one else that you suspect?" There was none the law could find. That evening, she was escorted to the Taunton jail, a larger and more secure facility than the small holding cell in Fall River. A single cell awaited her, whitewashed walls, a narrow cot, and a barred window looking out toward a world that had now completely turned against her. The women's jail matron later described her as remarkably composed, courteous, reading her Bible each evening. But when the cell door closed for the night, another witness reported seeing her press her hand to her throat as if to physically keep something in, a silent, desperate gesture of containment. In the summer darkness, Fall River exhaled at last, a city exhausted by a week of horror and speculation. The house on Second Street stood sealed and silent, its rooms emptied of life, the wallpaper still faintly marked in places where blood had been scrubbed clean. On the parlor table, a small framed photograph of Andrew and Abby Borden remained, both unsmiling, their stiff, formal portraits captured for a future they would never see, unaware of what memory and infamy would make of them. And somewhere behind prison walls, Lizzie Borden, 32 years old, closed her eyes and perhaps whispered a prayer that history would not hear. It was the end of the beginning. The investigation was over. The accused was in custody, but the trial, the verdict, and the creation of a myth, that was all still to come. The morning of June 5th, 1893, arrived heavy with humidity and a suffocating sense of anticipation. After 10 long months of incarceration, investigation, and fevered public speculation, Fall River's most infamous daughter was about to face 12 men who would decide whether she lived the rest of her life free or died a legend on the gallows. The trial of Lizzie Andrew Borden did not open in Fall River, a town already saturated with bias and gossip. It was moved 20 miles away to the New Bedford Superior Court, a grand, imposing stone building meant to project the gravity and impartiality of the law. The air inside smelled of old wood, dust, and fresh ink. Reporters from across the country packed the press benches shoulder to shoulder, their pencils sharpened, their notebooks open, ready to capture every blink, every whisper, every subtle tremor of the accused. The courthouse had become a theater. Inside sat 100 carefully selected spectators, their morbid curiosity clothed in their Sunday best. Outside, hundreds more crowded along the granite steps and spilled onto the street, fanning themselves with newspapers that carried her face. The nation, it seemed, had arrived to watch a spectacle disguised as justice. When Lizzie Borden entered the courtroom, the collective noise of the crowd dropped to nothing. It was a silence so complete it felt like a physical presence. She walked with a steady, almost gliding gait, escorted by two officers. She wore a simple gray silk dress, high necked and severe in its modesty, with a matching capelet. White gloves concealed her hands. Her face, framed by a small dark hat, was unreadable, calm, pale, almost spectral under the courtroom's gaslight. She took her seat between her attorneys, a formidable pair assembled to defend her. On one side was Andrew Jennings, the loyal Fall River lawyer who had known her family for years, a man whose quiet demeanor hid a sharp legal mind. On the other was the man who would become the public face of her defense, George D. Robinson, the highly respected former governor of Massachusetts. His presence alone signaled the seriousness and expense of the defense effort. To the public that strained to see her, she was both a curiosity and a profound contradiction. Her demeanor was too quiet to fit the image of a bloodthirsty monster, yet too composed to align with the expected hysteria of an innocent woman wrongly accused. She was a puzzle. One reporter for a Boston paper described her as a statue in gray silk, graceful but with hollow, watchful eyes. Another wrote, "If guilt has a face, it hides behind this one with a veil of perfect composure." She looked straight ahead, her gaze fixed on the three presiding judges. As the clerk of the court rose to read the indictment, his voice echoed in the cavernous room. A clerk's formal, resonant voice. Lizzie Andrew Borden of Fall River, in the county of Bristol, on the 4th day of August, in the year of our Lord, 1987, 1892, with force and arms, did feloniously and with malice aforethought assault one Abby Durfee Borden with a certain dangerous weapon, and did kill and murder the said Abby Durfee Borden. The prosecution opened first. The district attorney, Hosea M. Knowlton, a sharp featured and relentlessly methodical man, stood before the jury with the quiet poise of someone who believed entirely in the righteousness of his case. He did not raise his voice. He did not resort to theatrics. He simply began to build a cage of logic, bar by irrefutable bar. A man's calm, confident voice, like Knowlton's. Gentlemen of the jury, this is not a tale of mystery. It is not a story of a phantom intruder who came and went like a ghost. It is a simple, grim tale of domestic strife, of greed, resentment, and the deliberate removal of human obstacles. He painted the picture clearly and methodically. He described a house divided by tension and bitterness. A daughter, 32 years old and unmarried, grown resentful under her father's suffocating financial control. A stepmother, unloved and unwanted, viewed as a rival for a vast inheritance. And two sudden, brutal deaths that, in a single morning, opened the door to immense wealth and personal freedom. Knowlton's case was built entirely on circumstantial evidence. He acknowledged this from the start. He had no witness who saw the act, no confession, no bloody handprint. But he argued that the circumstances, when woven together, created a rope of logic so strong it was as good as a confession. He reminded the jury that no stranger had been seen entering or leaving the Borden home that morning. He reminded them that the doors were found locked from within. He pointed out that Bridget Sullivan, the maid and the only other person in the house, had an established alibi. She was either outside washing windows or resting in her attic room during the times the murders were committed. Knowlton's measured tone returns. Who then, gentlemen, who then could have committed these terrible acts save the one person who had the motive, who had the opportunity, and who remained within those walls, calm and composed, while her victims lay dead. It was simple logic, beautifully, brutally simple. It asked the jury to look past the defendant's respectable exterior and see the cold, hard reality of the facts as he presented them. When George D. Robinson rose to speak, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. He was a commanding presence, a former governor who understood the art of persuasion, not just as law, but as theater. He did not immediately attack the evidence. Instead, he sought to dismantle the very foundation of belief upon which the prosecution's case was built. A confident, deliberate, and slightly warmer tone, like Robinson's. The Commonwealth will present you with a theory. It will tell you what it cannot show you. It will tell you what it believes, not what it can prove. We ask only, gentlemen, that you listen for the silences between their facts, for the questions their theory fails to answer. He reminded the jury that despite a thorough search, not a single drop of blood had been found on Lizzie's person or her clothing. He posed a powerful theatrical question. How could a person commit two such frenzied, bloody attacks and emerge without a single stain? He said, with a slight ironic smile. If Miss Borden is guilty as charged, she is the cleanest and most fortunate murderer who ever lived. Robinson then began to paint his own portrait of the defendant. He did not present her as a monster, but as a model of Victorian womanhood, a dutiful daughter, a beloved Sunday school teacher, a woman devoted to charity and her church, respected by all who truly knew her. He described her composure on the day of the murders not as coldness, but as courage in the face of unimaginable horror. In his words, she became less a suspect and more a victim of her gender and her class. He implied that the jury was being asked to believe the impossible, that a refined Christian woman was capable of a savage, unfeminine act of butchery. He was subtly arguing that she was being judged not for the presence of blood, but for the absence of tears, for breaking the expected script of female grief. In that moment, the trial's central battlefield became clear. It was not just about what happened on August 4th, 1892. It was about what the world and 12 men in a jury box believed a woman was capable of. The 12 jurors, all men, as was the law, watched Lizzie Borden closely. They were a cross section of Bristol County: farmers, merchants, a bookkeeper, a carriage maker. They were ordinary men, unaccustomed to judging a case of such extraordinary brutality and fame. Their faces were impassive, but their eyes followed her every move. Outside the courtroom, the nation watched with them. Telegraph lines buzzed like nervous veins, carrying updates to every major newspaper in America. Reporters sent dispatches by the hour describing her dress, her posture, the way she fanned herself against the heat. In Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, readers followed the trial as if it were a serialized work of fiction. Every gesture became evidence. Every glance was interpreted as motive. A handkerchief brought to the lips was seen as a sign of concealed guilt. A quiet prayer before the day's proceedings was hailed as proof of unwavering innocence. Meanwhile, a cottage industry of morbid commerce sprang up around the trial. Vendors outside the courthouse sold souvenir programs labeled "The Borden Trial, a Family Tragedy," complete with woodcut illustrations of the principal figures. Photographs of Lizzie, Andrew, and Abby were sold on the street. Curiosity had become a commodity. Women who were not permitted to serve on juries crowded into the public gallery, their whispers a constant, soft counterpoint to the legal proceedings. They commented on her dress, her hair, her stoic calm. Some said she looked saintly, like a martyr. Others said she looked like death itself, her composure a chilling mask. The trial had become a mirror, reflecting not only Lizzie's fate, but the deep seated fears and morbid fascinations of a nation grappling with the unthinkable, that the most terrible violence could erupt from within the sacred confines of the family home. Inside the courtroom, A strict decorum ruled like a religion. The presiding judge, Justice Justin Dewey, maintained order with the gentle but firm authority of a seasoned schoolmaster. There would be no applause, no gasps, no emotional outbursts from the gallery. Yet, emotion simmered just beneath the surface. Each time the prosecution began to describe the wounds, the number of gashes, the use of blunt force, the shattering of bone, Lizzie's face paled further. Her hand, gloved in white, would grip the arm of her chair until her knuckles whitened. At one point, as a witness began to describe the state of Andrew Borden's face as it was found on the sofa, Lizzie turned away sharply, her body language a silent scream. She whispered to her lawyer, "Don't, please don't," and looked as if she were about to faint. The court was recessed for 10 minutes, and when she returned to her seat minutes later, she was once again composed, her face a pale, impassive mask. It was the same unnerving stillness that had so unsettled the police officers nearly a year before. Some in the courtroom saw a woman of incredible fortitude, enduring a public humiliation with quiet dignity. Others saw a masterful performance, an actress playing the part of a grieving daughter. The line between strength and concealment grew thinner with each passing hour. By evening, the first day of the trial of Lizzie Borden had set its tone. It would be measured, theatrical, and drenched in paradox. The prosecution had drawn a clear, logical picture of motive and opportunity. The defense had begun the work of dismantling the picture frame itself, questioning the very possibility of the image within. As the crowd spilled back out into the hot summer air, the reporters rushed to file their first dispatches. "Borden girl cool as stone under fire," wrote one. "The angel of death in gray silk," proclaimed another. The courthouse emptied, but the story had only just begun. In the coming days and weeks, the evidence, the handleless hatchet, the conflicting testimonies, the story of the burned dress would unravel or rebuild itself under the immense weight of sworn testimony. And in that charged space between cold logic and popular legend, Lizzie Borden's fate would be written. The second day of the Lizzie Borden trial opened beneath a gray and oppressive New England sky. Inside the courthouse, the air felt thicker than the day before, the kind of stagnant, heavy atmosphere that carried whispers and judgment in equal measure. The reporters were already scribbling in their notebooks before the judge's gavel struck, eager to capture the next chapter in a story that had seized the nation's imagination. The prosecution, led by the methodical Hosea Knowlton, began laying out its evidence. Their strategy was not to find a single definitive piece of proof, a smoking gun, as it were, but to build a structure of circumstantial certainty. Every fact was a nail, every logical assumption a plank, and when assembled, it was meant to look enough like a gallows to make the jury deeply uneasy. The first point of fascination was the Borden home itself. The prosecution presented detailed architectural drawings, transforming the house from a private residence into a puzzle box. The jury was shown a fortress of locked doors and strict, unvarying routines. The front door had three separate locks, often bolted even during the day. Each interior room, it was said, required a key. Privacy in the Borden house was not a right, it was a constant, deliberate negotiation of access. The prosecution argued that this layout, this obsession with security, all but eliminated the possibility of a random intruder. To reach the second floor guest room where Abby Borden had been slain, an outsider would have had to pass directly through the kitchen or the sitting room, both areas where Lizzie Borden placed herself during that crucial morning hour. To get to Andrew on the settee, a killer would have had to enter a house that was, by all accounts, sealed from within. A stranger, Knowlton argued, could not have entered unseen. A stranger, he said, could not have left without leaving the echo of an unbolted door. The logic was simple. If no one could get in, the killer must have already been inside. The defense, led by the unflappable George Robinson, countered calmly. The doors were indeed complex, but their very complexity made them fallible. The locks could jam. Bridget, the maid, admitted under questioning that she sometimes left the back screen door unlatched on hot days. The fortress that seemed so perfectly sealed on paper might not have been sealed at all in practice. In that small crack of uncertainty, the case began to breathe. A house with a possibly unlocked door was a house that could, just barely, admit a phantom. When the broken hatchet head was carried into the courtroom, a hush fell. The audience leaned forward as one. It was small, gray, and cold looking. The handle was missing, cleanly broken off near the head. Police had found it in the cellar, resting in a wooden box filled with dust and ash. The blade, they claimed, had been recently cleaned. It was too clean, they argued, for a tool left to rust in a damp basement. The coating of ash seemed suspicious, as if it had been deliberately applied to conceal any remaining traces of blood. It became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, the supposed murder weapon. Dr. William Dolan, the medical examiner, took the stand and described the horrific wounds inflicted on Andrew and Abby Borden. He spoke of blunt trauma, of sharp, incised edges, of a series of 14 to 19 blows delivered to Abby's skull. Each swing, he testified, was delivered with controlled, terrible force. District Attorney Knowlton lifted the hatchet head, its dull metal catching the gaslight. He held it aloft for the jury to see, a silent, menacing object. Knowlton's voice, quiet but firm. Gentlemen, this instrument fits the wounds. Its blade is consistent with the nature of the injuries described by Dr. Dolan, and it was found not 2 yards from where the defendant, Miss Borden, admits she often stood in the cellar. The defense rose in objection. George Robinson, his voice measured and cutting, began to dismantle the prosecution's prized piece of evidence. He pointed out the obvious. No blood had been found on the blade, not even a microscopic trace. The handle was missing, a detail convenient for speculation, he argued, but fatal for certainty. Where was the rest of the weapon? Robinson's voice, measured and powerful. If the Commonwealth believes this to be the murder weapon, then it must also explain why not a single drop of blood, not a single human hair, clings to it. Was it washed? By whom? With what water? In what basin? And where, gentlemen, is the proof? The jury listened, their faces motionless. One farmer on the panel glanced toward Lizzie. Her face remained a mask of placid indifference, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The hatchet head, so menacing in the prosecutor's hand, now seemed merely like what it was, a broken, rusted piece of metal. Then came the matter of the dress, the infamous paint stained garment that Lizzie had burned in the kitchen stove. Alice Russell, Lizzie's close friend and confidant, was called to the stand. Her testimony was perhaps the most damaging to Lizzie's character. Her voice trembled as she recalled the Sunday morning, just 3 days after the murders, when she had been staying in the house to comfort the Borden sisters. A woman's voice, gentle and filled with regret, like Alice Russell's. I saw her at the stove, burning a dress. She said, she said it had paint on it and was ruined. But I thought it strange to do it then. A ripple of sound moved through the courtroom like wind across tall grass. Here was a direct witness to an act of destruction, an act that seemed, on its face, to be a clear attempt to destroy evidence. To the prosecution, the burned blue Bedford court dress was the erased proof of blood spatter. It was the missing piece of the puzzle, deliberately turned to ash. To the defense, it was simply an act of housekeeping, nothing more. Andrew Jennings, Lizzie's other attorney, leaned forward in his cross examination. His voice was firm but unfailingly polite. He reminded the jury that Lizzie owned several similar blue dresses. He brought Bridget, the maid, back to the stand, who testified that she had seen no blood on Lizzie's clothing that morning, and he emphasized that no one, not one soul, had ever seen Lizzie clean or change her attire after the murders. The burned dress became both a symbol and smoke, solid enough to anchor suspicion, but vaporous enough to inspire doubt. It was an act of incriminating behavior, but with no underlying physical evidence to support it. The prosecution built its timeline with the cool precision of a watchmaker. Abby Borden, they argued, was killed around 9:30 a.m. Andrew nearly 2 hours later, just before 11:10 a.m. That gap, those 90 minutes, was the central riddle that obsessed the jury. Could Lizzie Borden have brutally murdered her stepmother, cleaned herself and the weapon so perfectly that not a trace of blood remained, concealed the weapon, and then waited with calm composure for her father to return home, only to strike again? Could she then have maintained that same composure as she called out, "Father's dead. Someone's come in and killed him," without betraying the faintest tremor of guilt? The prosecution believed she could. They described her as methodical, controlled, and emotionally flat, traits that in a man might be seen as disciplined, but in a woman accused of murder were recast as dangerously deviant. The defense countered with brutal simplicity. "No human being," George Robinson declared, his voice resonating through the courtroom, "could butcher two people in broad daylight inside an occupied house and leave not a single footprint, not a single stain, not a single sound that alerted another living soul." He argued it was a physical and psychological impossibility. The ticking clock grew louder in the silent courtroom, each tick a reminder of the weight of those missing minutes and the profound absence of definitive proof. The witnesses, one by one, painted a portrait of contradiction. Dr. Bowen swore under oath that Lizzie was startlingly calm but pale when he arrived. So calm, in fact, that it frightened him. He had expected hysteria, but found a strange, unsettling quiet. Bridget Sullivan, the maid, in her nervous and often confusing testimony, admitted that she hadn't laid eyes on Lizzie for a crucial period of nearly half an hour between Andrew's return and the discovery of his body. That was the window. Neighbors who lived just feet away testified to hearing nothing: no screams, no thuds, no desperate cry for help. Even the family's dog, which was kept in the barn, hadn't barked. It was as if the violence had moved through the Borden home like a ghost, leaving only its terrible work behind. One juror, a carriage maker from a nearby town, was seen shaking his head slowly during Bridget's testimony. Another, a farmer, stared at Lizzie for a long moment, his pencil unmoving on his notepad. Every word spoken in that courtroom walked a tightrope between cold, hard logic and the much more powerful force of human belief. And by the end of the day, even the seasoned reporters struggled to decide which side was winning. As the afternoon wore on, the prosecution's case, for all its logical structure, began to fray at the edges. Their evidence was abundant, but none of it bled. There was no weapon definitively proven. There was no eyewitness, there was no confession, there was only the chilling, orderly silence of a locked house and a woman far too composed for anyone's comfort. Hosea Knowlton ended the day with a final impassioned appeal to reason, or perhaps to the jury's ability to believe in the story he was telling. Knowlton's voice, steady and firm: "Circumstance, gentlemen, is the hand of truth. It is a chain of facts that, when linked together, will draw you to a conclusion as surely as a confession, and the truth leaves her prints, even if the blood is gone." Lizzie looked up then, her gaze moving from her hands to the prosecutor. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the silent courtroom. The jury watched, caught between two powerful competing stories, both of them incomplete. By the time the court adjourned for the day, no one could agree whether the case against Lizzie Borden had grown stronger or weaker, only that the mystery at its heart had deepened. Outside, as the press filed their next dispatches, one headline captured the central paradox of the day: the woman without blood or guilt. By the third week of the trial, a subtle change had come over the courtroom and the nation that watched it. The public had begun to tire of blood. The initial morbid novelty of the horror had dulled, replaced by a yearning for something more than just gruesome details. Now they wanted a revelation, something clean, final, and emotionally satisfying. But what they got instead was doubt. And doubt, in the hands of a master, is the sharpest and most effective tool in the practice of law. It was the defense's turn when George D. Robinson, former governor of Massachusetts, rose to his feet to present the defense's case. He did not storm the court with fiery rhetoric. He disarmed it. He was the embodiment of calm, patriarchal authority, courteous, deliberate, his voice never rising to a shout, but never faltering in its conviction. He spoke not as a lawyer fighting for a client, but as a statesman guiding a jury toward a just and logical conclusion. A man's voice, calm and resonant like Robinson's. The Commonwealth's case, gentlemen of the jury, is not a chain of evidence. It is a necklace of guesses strung together with the thread of suspicion. Reporters, who had been slouched in their seats, leaned forward. The jurors, weary from weeks of grim testimony, adjusted their postures. Robinson continued, his method one of simple, relentless logic. Robinson's voice: they ask you to believe that this young woman, Miss Borden, could commit two of the most brutal murders imaginable and yet carry not a single drop of blood on her person, that she could wash, change her clothes, conceal a weapon, and compose herself in the span of mere minutes, that she could fool her physician, her trusted friend, her maid, and every soul who entered that house, all before the city hall clock struck 11. His words didn't strike, they soaked in. Each carefully chosen syllable began to erode the foundation of certainty that the prosecution had so painstakingly built. He was not just arguing facts, he was challenging the very limits of human possibility. The defense's first and perhaps most powerful witness was Emma Borden, Lizzie's older sister. She was a quiet, reserved woman of 43, dressed in somber black. Her presence brought a palpable sense of family tragedy into the courtroom, a dimension the prosecution's cold narrative had lacked. She testified to Lizzie's character, her kindness to animals, her devotion to her father, and her strained but respectful relationship with their stepmother. Her voice was calm, almost subdued, but carried the weight of conviction. A woman's voice, quiet and firm, like Emma's. My sister loved our father. She was a very affectionate daughter to him. She could not have done such a thing. It is not in her nature. She also provided a crucial piece of testimony regarding the infamous burned dress. Emma stated that she had personally advised Lizzie to destroy the dress, not because it was bloodstained, but because it was old, faded, and had been accidentally smeared with brown paint weeks earlier. I said to her, "Why don't you burn that old thing? It is only fit to be burned." The defense allowed the silence that followed her testimony to stretch thin. Emotion filled the space where loud argument had been. Her words humanized Lizzie, transforming her from a cold, calculating suspect into a sister, a daughter. Emma's presence reminded the jury of something the prosecution had neglected: the profound absence of overt hatred. For all the whispers about tension in the Borden house, no witness could swear to ever hearing Lizzie utter a single threat against her father or stepmother. For the first time, the trial felt less like a spectacle of monstrosity and more like a deeply sad family tragedy. Next, the defense summoned Dr. Seabury Bowen, the family physician who had been one of the first on the scene and who had attended to Lizzie in the hours and days after the murders. His testimony would become one of Robinson's sharpest blades. Dr. Bowen testified that he had found Lizzie in a state of nervous exhaustion and shock. He described her as being on the verge of collapse. To calm her nerves, he had prescribed her a regular dose of morphine, a common sedative at the time. A tired, soft male voice, like Dr. Bowen's. I prescribed her morphine to calm her nerves and to help her rest. She was not herself. Under the influence of the drug, she was sedated and at times confused. That single word, sedated, recast the entire narrative of the police interrogation and the inquest. The prosecution had painted Lizzie's inconsistent statements, her confusion about the timeline, her contradictory answers about her whereabouts, as clear proof of deceit and a guilty conscience. But now, the defense reframed it all as the natural byproduct of a mind clouded by grief, shock, and powerful medication. In that instant, her contradictions lost their poison. What had once sounded cunning and evasive now sounded tragically human. The jury now had a reason to doubt the very testimony that had led to her arrest. The defense then launched a full scale assault on the era's fragile and often unreliable forensic science. They brought in their own expert, Dr. Edward S. Wood, a renowned professor of chemistry from Harvard University. Dr. Wood testified that he had conducted the most advanced chemical tests available on the handleless hatchet head found in the cellar. His conclusion was unequivocal. He had found no trace of blood, not on the blade, not in the crevices, not anywhere. He also tested Lizzie's clothing and found no microscopic residue of blood. George Robinson addressed the jury, his voice cool and steady. Robinson's voice: the Commonwealth presents you with a weapon that has no blood. They present you with a defendant who has no blood on her person. You have no weapon, you have no witness, you have no confession. You have suspicion wearing a police uniform. It was 1893, decades before fingerprinting, blood typing, or DNA analysis. In the absence of such definitive science, the gaps in the prosecution's case became chasms. Science could not close those gaps, so storytelling did. And George Robinson's story of a botched investigation and a rush to judgment was far cleaner and more compelling than the state's bloody but unproven theory. He reminded the jury that Lizzie's calm demeanor, the very thing the prosecution used against her, was the natural expression of a well bred woman enduring shock and exhaustion, not the sign of a cold, evil heart. He spoke gently, but every word was a wedge, prying the jury's reason away from their fear. There was another powerful current running quietly beneath the surface of the trial, one that had nothing to do with evidence or testimony. It was the deeply ingrained ideology of Victorian womanhood. In 1893, women of Lizzie Borden's class were seen as the moral anchors of the home. They were considered purer, more delicate, and less capable of base animalistic violence than men. The idea of a woman, a Sunday school teacher no less, wielding a heavy hatchet to brutally murder her own father was almost mythological in its horror, a grotesque inversion of nature itself. The defense never had to say it outright, but George Robinson let that powerful cultural current do his work for him. In his closing arguments, he would turn to the jury, his tone almost tender. Robinson's voice: gentlemen, you see before you a Christian woman, a teacher of your children, a daughter who nursed her father in illness and cared for her home. Does that look like murder's hand to you? To find her guilty, you must believe she is a fiend. Gentlemen, does she look it? No one answered. They didn't need to. The jurors were all men, raised in a world where women's purity was considered an absolute. To convict Lizzie Borden would have meant admitting that the world they knew, the world of quiet Christian homes and dutiful daughters, was capable of such darkness from within, and that perhaps was a truth too terrible for them to bear. By the fifth week of the trial, the energy in the courtroom had profoundly changed. What had begun as a siege on a likely suspect had slowly transformed into the rescue of a wrongly accused woman. The prosecution's evidence, once sharp and menacing, now looked fragile and incomplete. The defense's narrative, once unthinkable, now seemed not only plausible, but almost inevitable. When George Robinson gave his closing argument, he spoke for nearly 5 hours, not as a lawyer engaged in legal acrobatics, but as a man delivering a sermon on reason, doubt, and justice. Robinson's voice, impassioned but calm. Lizzie Borden has sat here, silent and patient, while her life, her character, and her very soul have been dissected before strangers. And yet, after all this, not one witness, not one, has placed an axe in her hand. There is not a spot of blood, not a shred of evidence. To find her guilty, gentlemen, you must decide that a woman is to hang by suspicion alone. Reporters in the gallery described the room as spellbound. Even Hosea Knowlton, the prosecutor, sat motionless, his face unreadable, knowing that the tide had turned against him. When Robinson finally finished, he bowed his head. Lizzie's eyes, dry for weeks, brimmed with tears for the first time since the trial began. And the jury, 12 ordinary men, looked at her no longer as a monstrous killer, but as someone their own daughters might resemble, a woman overwhelmed by tragedy. The case, in that pivotal moment, was no longer about proof. It had become about perception. And perception, once it has been so masterfully shifted, rarely turns back. The defense had done what few had thought possible. They hadn't just defended Lizzie Borden, they had disarmed the very idea of her guilt. The final morning of the trial, June 20th, 1893, broke warm and cloudless over New Bedford, Massachusetts. The storms of the previous days had passed, leaving a clean, bright sky that seemed to mock the murky questions that still hung over the courthouse. Inside, the air smelled of floor varnish, old paper, and stale ink. It was thick with the weight of an unfinished fate. The jury had retired the previous afternoon after listening to the final, powerful closing arguments. Now, all that was left was the waiting. For 66 minutes, 12 men deliberated in the silence of a locked room. But to the world outside, it felt like an eternity. The courthouse and the streets beyond spun with speculation. Some said it would end in a swift conviction. The circumstantial evidence, they argued, was too strong. Others were certain the jury would never agree to hang a minister's daughter, a woman of her social standing. Inside the courtroom, Lizzie sat motionless in her chair, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. Her sister Emma sat beside her, a pillar of quiet support. Lizzie's expression was a study in stillness, stillness made flesh. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed on nothing, her posture erect. She had been silent for months, her story told only through the voices of her lawyers. Now, even her silence had become part of her legend. At 3:38 p.m., the door to the jury room opened. 12 men filed back into the courtroom, their faces as unreadable as stone. They did not look at the defendant. They did not look at the prosecutors. They took their seats, their movements stiff and formal. The clerk of the court stood. The foreman, a man named Charles J. Holmes, handed him a single folded piece of paper. The courtroom froze. Every breath was held. The rustle of a single paper would have sounded like a roar. The clerk unfolded the paper. His voice, when he spoke, was clear and steady, cutting through the silence. A clerk's formal voice. Gentlemen of the jury, have you agreed upon a verdict? A foreman's voice, firm. We have. Clerk's voice. And what is your verdict? He read from the paper. Clerk's voice. On the first indictment, charging the murder of Andrew J. Borden, we find the defendant, Lizzie Andrew Borden, not guilty. Clerk's voice continuing, on the second indictment charging the murder of Abby D. Borden, we find the defendant not guilty. There was no gasp from the crowd, no immediate applause, just a single sharp sound, the sound of Lizzie Borden's breath breaking in a strangled sob. A tremor ran through her shoulders, and she collapsed. her head falling onto the table in front of her. She rose slowly, trembling, her composure finally shattered. Tears filled her eyes as she leaned on her sister and whispered, her voice choked with emotion, "Oh, take me home. I want to go home. I am so glad." Her lawyers, George Robinson and Andrew Jennings, surrounded her, their hands gripping her shoulders, their own faces softened by a profound and overwhelming relief. The reporters, silent for a moment, scrambled for the doors, their pens barely able to keep pace with history. Outside, the courthouse erupted. As the news spread from the courtroom to the street, the crowd surged forward. Hats were thrown into the air. Cheers and curses intermingled, a chaotic chorus of public opinion. Some wept with relief, convinced that justice for a wronged woman had been served. Others spat on the ground in disgust, certain that a monster had been set free. The name Borden became a fire, a source of warmth to some, a searing burn to others. Inside, the jurors avoided Lizzie's eyes. They had not been moved by sympathy, they later told the press, only by the profound and unshakable absence of proof. A juror's voice, solemn and defensive. The evidence, as presented by the Commonwealth, was insufficient for a conviction. We could not prove she committed the murders, and the doubt was far too large a thing to hang a woman upon. The judge dismissed the court. The trial that had consumed the nation for 3 weeks was over in a matter of minutes. Lizzie and Emma were escorted from the building under heavy police guard, hurried through a side exit to avoid the mob. But no physical threat followed them, only the heavy, disbelieving hush of the crowd as her carriage pulled away. Within hours, the verdict traveled by telegraph across the country. By nightfall, it was the headline in every major city, from Boston to San Francisco. Lizzie Borden acquitted. The Fall River tragedy ends in triumph for the accused. A woman declared free, but is she clean? In Boston, women's suffrage groups and other progressive organizations hailed the verdict as a victory for fairness, proof that a woman could stand before a court of men and not be condemned by prejudice. In New York, however, editorial pages sneered, calling the verdict a gross miscarriage of gallantry. A cynical columnist's voice. It seems that no man would have walked free on such a mountain of circumstantial evidence. But a woman, properly dressed and fashionably pale, may apparently kill her parents with impunity, provided she does so with good manners. Public opinion split like wood under the strain of an axe. Some believed she had been the victim of a bumbling police force and a town eager to sacrifice one of its own. Others were convinced she had escaped justice through a combination of a brilliant lawyer, a sympathetic jury, and the protective veil of her gender and class. The legal case had ended, but the story of Lizzie Borden had only grown teeth. The verdict had not provided closure, it had created a legend. When Lizzie Borden returned to Fall River, a free and wealthy woman, the air was thick with the August heat and with a cold, silent judgment. The house on Second Street, a place of horror and infamy, was abandoned almost immediately. Neighbors closed their curtains as her carriage passed. Old friends, who had once shared tea with her, now crossed the street to avoid her gaze. She was acquitted, but she was not forgiven. With the considerable inheritance she and Emma now controlled, they purchased Maplecroft, a large, stylish Queen Anne style home on French Street, high up on the hill. It was the life Lizzie had always craved, a grand house in a fashionable neighborhood, with new walls to hold old silences. She redecorated it lavishly. Fine rugs, mahogany furniture, a grand piano in the parlor. She named the house herself, a poetic, aspirational name, as if giving it a new soul might somehow erase the one that haunted her own. But no house, no matter how grand, could keep out what had already entered her life. Gossip became her constant shadow, and the rhyme, the cruel, simple, unforgettable rhyme, spread like wildfire. It was written by anonymous tongues and carried on the lips of children who had never met her, who knew nothing of the trial, but who understood the power of a dark and simple story. She never escaped it. In the years that followed, Lizzie lived quietly at Maplecroft, her name both a local curse and a morbid curiosity. She was the ghost of Fall River, a woman everyone knew of, but few truly knew. She attended church less and less often, shunned by the very congregation she had once served. She adopted stray animals, showering them with the affection she no longer received from her community. She developed a passion for the theater and hosted small, lavish gatherings for actors and actresses, but few local visitors ever came more than once. Her sister Emma, her staunchest defender during the trial, finally left Maplecroft in 1905 after a bitter and mysterious quarrel. The reason for their final break was never made public, but rumors circulated that it was over money, or perhaps over Lizzie's unconventional friendship with an actress named Nance O'Neill. They never spoke again. By the time Lizzie Borden died of pneumonia in 1927 at the age of 66, the world had changed. The Victorian hush had given way to the roar of the jazz age. But her name and her myth endured like a stain that would not wash out. By a strange twist of fate, her estranged sister Emma died just 9 days later. And though Lizzie was buried in the family plot in Oak Grove Cemetery, alongside the father and stepmother she was accused of murdering, the town never truly decided whether she belonged there. Even now, visitors to the cemetery leave pennies on her flat gravestone, tiny, silent offerings to a mystery that never quite sleeps. The trial of Lizzie Borden remains one of America's earliest and most enduring true crime obsessions. It shaped the way we tell stories of guilt and innocence, especially when the accused is a woman who defies our expectations. It revealed how justice can bend under the immense weight of culture, how the coldness of evidence and the warmth of perception can never truly be separated in a jury's mind. For some, Lizzie Borden was a victim of a patriarchal society, a woman hounded by a biased press and a clumsy police force. For others, she was a cunning and ruthless murderer who slipped through the fingers of history, her acquittal a testament to the power of wealth and social status. The truth, whatever it may be, lies somewhere in the locked rooms of that house on Second Street, in the space between silence and scream, between blood and respectability. And perhaps that is why we still whisper her name, why her story continues to fascinate us more than a century later, because the mystery, in its perfect, chilling ambiguity, remains cleaner and more compelling than the messy, unknowable truth could ever be. When the verdict was read and Lizzie Borden walked free from the New Bedford courthouse, the town of Fall River did not cheer. It did not erupt in celebration, nor did it fall into a collective righteous anger. It simply exhaled, a long, slow, uneasy breath, thick with the unresolved tension of the past year. The courthouse emptied. The newspapers went to press with their bold, triumphant, or cynical headlines, and the townspeople returned to their routines. But beneath the familiar sounds of hammers on the walls of the granite mills and the rhythmic clatter of horses on cobblestones, the whispering began again. It was no longer about the blood, the hatchet, or the timeline. The trial had exhausted those questions. Now the whispers were about the why. Because in Fall River, the question of motive was never truly solved by the court. It was merely set aside. In the absence of a legal answer, the question hid itself behind lace curtains and closed doors, waiting to be spoken aloud in parlors and on street corners. To understand the motives that might have lived and festered inside that house, we have to return not to the grisly details of the crime scene, but to the cold, silent life within those walls. We have to examine the economy of affection, the currency of control, and the slow, corrosive decay that can occur when love turns to obligation. Even before the murders, the Borden home was a house divided, not just by walls and a multitude of locked doors, but by loyalty, resentment, and the ever present specter of inheritance. Andrew Borden, the patriarch, was a towering figure in Fall River, though not in stature. At 70 years old, he was worth an estimated $300,000, a colossal sum in 1892, equivalent to many millions today. He was a man of rigid, almost pathological thrift and deeply conservative values. He owned the A.J. Borden building, a large commercial block downtown. He was a director of the Globe Yarn Mill and president of the Union Savings Bank. Yet he chose to live without comfort, a habit that looked like moral virtue to some and sheer cruelty to others, especially his daughters. Abby Borden, the stepmother, was by most accounts a kind and practical woman. She was not the cruel stepmother of fairy tales, but in the eyes of Lizzie and her older sister Emma, she was an intruder, a placeholder for their deceased mother, and most critically, a rival. The word mother had not crossed Lizzie's lips in reference to Abby in over 5 years. In public and in private, she was Mrs. Borden. It was a small, seemingly petty defiance, but in a house where emotions were suppressed and communication had broken down, small acts of defiance were everything. They were the only weapons available. The trouble, as trouble so often does in families of wealth, began with money and property. It was a tangible map of affection and loyalty. Years before the murders, Andrew Borden had made a decision that, in his mind, was likely a simple gesture of familial generosity. He purchased a house for Abby's half sister, Sarah Whitehead, to live in. Later, he formally transferred the deed of that property into Abby's name. It was a business transaction, a shifting of assets. But to his daughters, Lizzie and Emma, it was an act of profound betrayal. To them, it was concrete proof that their stepmother's family was inheriting what should rightfully pass to them, the Borden bloodline. The fear that had simmered for years, that Abby would be the primary beneficiary of their father's will, was now seemingly coming to pass while he was still alive. The confrontation that followed was not loud or dramatic, but quiet and seething, as Borden family arguments often were. Lizzie and Emma presented a united front. The result was a tense negotiation that ended with a concession from Andrew to keep the peace. He purchased their maternal grandfather's former home and deeded it to them for the symbolic sum of $1. But this transaction did not bring peace. It was a business deal, not an act of reconciliation. The trust was irrevocably broken. From that point on, tensions simmered through each polite, silent breakfast, through the formal clinking of spoons against china in the hushed dining room. The sisters began eating their meals separately from their parents, often taking trays to their rooms. They locked their bedroom doors at night, creating small, private fortresses within the larger, unhappier one. The conversations between Lizzie and her father became cold exchanges of necessity, stripped of any warmth. Even the household staff felt the stark division. Bridget Sullivan, the maid, would later testify with simple, telling honesty, a woman's voice with a soft Irish lilt, like Bridget's. They did not get on. They hardly spoke to one another. There was something in the air. You could feel it. Something in the air, indeed. The chill of resentment was as palpable as the summer heat. Then, on the day before the murders, Wednesday, August 3rd, 1892, Lizzie Borden made a strange and solitary errand. She walked to Smith's drugstore on South Main Street, a journey of just a few blocks from her home. Inside, she approached the pharmacist, a man named Eli Bentz. She asked for 10 cents worth of prussic acid, a common name for hydrogen cyanide, a deadly and fast acting poison. She claimed she needed it to clean a sealskin cape. The pharmacist was taken aback. Prussic acid was a highly controlled substance, known for its toxicity. Bentz refused to sell it to her without a doctor's prescription. He remembered her distinctly. a small woman, neatly dressed in a dark blue dress, deliberate and calm in her speech. When he refused the sale, she did not argue or protest. She simply turned and left the store. That single, uneventful errand, lasting no more than a few minutes, would later become one of the most haunting and debated footnotes in the history of American true crime, because the very next morning, two people in her home would die, not by poison, but by the brutal force of an axe. And the pharmacist's testimony, the clear, unambiguous recollection of the respectable Miss Borden asking for a deadly poison the day before the murders, was ultimately ruled inadmissible at her trial. The defense argued it was irrelevant, as poison was not the cause of death. The judge agreed. The court never heard it, the jury never knew, but the town of Fall River never forgot. It became a dark whisper, a piece of the puzzle that didn't fit, suggesting a premeditation that was even colder and more calculated than the crime itself. In the months leading up to the murders, another strange event had occurred, one that seemed to foreshadow the coming violence and deepen the family's paranoia. The Borden home had been burglarized, or so it was claimed. Jewelry, some cash, and a few other small items had disappeared, all from Lizzie's own room. Yet, when the police arrived to investigate, they found no signs of forced entry. The windows were secure, the doors were locked. Only the upstairs rooms, those belonging to the daughters, had been disturbed. Nothing was taken from Andrew and Abby's room. Andrew Borden's reaction was not one of anger toward outsiders. It was one of suspicion toward those within. Shortly after the incident, he had new, stronger locks installed inside the house, on the doors between the bedrooms. The message was clear and chilling. The danger was not on the street. He believed it was living under his own roof. It was after this event that Lizzie stopped eating dinner with her father and stepmother entirely. She began telling friends like Alice Russell that she feared the food in the house might be poisoned. She spoke of feeling wronged and unsafe. It was around this time that she began sleeping with the door to her own room bolted from the inside, a prisoner in her own home. Was the burglary a real event, a sign of an external threat? Or was it staged, a piece of domestic theater designed to create a narrative of persecution? We will never know. But it served to escalate the atmosphere of fear and suspicion to an unbearable level. When the trial ended and Lizzie was acquitted, the town of Fall River revisited all of it: the property transfers, the story of the poison, the strange burglary, the cold use of her stepmother's formal name. These were the puzzle pieces, and in the absence of a definitive picture from the court, the townspeople began to assemble them on their own. Each neighbor, each newspaper, each gossip circle built a different picture. Some said Lizzie's motive was simple: primal greed. She was furious about her inheritance, enraged that her father was favoring Abby's family. The murders, in this version, were a bloody business transaction to secure her financial future. Others whispered of something deeper, of insanity. They spoke of Lizzie's peculiar spells, her sometimes odd behavior, and theorized that years of emotional repression in that stifling house had finally caused her composure to crack, releasing a hidden, violent personality. A few even claimed there was a secret lover, a theory born from pure gossip, and a desire for a more romantic, dramatic narrative. This theory, however, had no evidence to support it whatsoever. There were darker, more disturbing rumors as well: whispers of an incestuous relationship between Lizzie and her father, and that the murders were an act of desperate, twisted rage. This, too, remains pure, unsubstantiated speculation, a theory born from the human need to find a motive as extreme as the crime itself. And yet, through all the theories, no new evidence ever surfaced that was strong enough to replace speculation with fact. In the absence of proof, rumor becomes its own form of architecture. And in the years that followed, Fall River built a veritable mansion of whispers around the name Lizzie Borden. By the time the 20th century began, her name no longer signified a woman. It signified a question. Was it greed? Was it rage born of years of resentment? Was it a sudden psychotic break? Or was it something simpler and perhaps more terrifying? A human breaking point reached in a house too small for so much silent hate. By the time Lizzie Borden returned to her new home on French Street, a free and wealthy woman, the public had already made up its mind. Or rather, it had made up its minds, plural. In the court of public opinion, there were only two verdicts available. She was either a woman wrongly and cruelly accused, a victim of circumstance and a flawed investigation, or she was a woman who had fooled the world, a monster of chilling composure who had slipped through the grasp of justice. But for those who would come to study the case in the years and decades that followed, the detectives, the historians, the criminal psychologists, the verdict was never an ending. It was an opening. It was a doorway back into that grim house on Second Street, back into its locked rooms, its oppressive silences, and its bloodless, infuriating secrets. There are many theories about who killed Andrew and Abby Borden and why. None have ever been definitively proven, but taken together, they form a complex geometry of guilt, a framework of intersecting lines that create the anatomy of suspicion. The first and perhaps most powerful axis of suspicion is the crime scene itself, or rather, the lack of one. When police first entered the Borden house on that sweltering August morning, they found two brutally murdered bodies, a trail of blood leading from the victims to the floor, and almost no other clues. There were no bloody footprints leading away from the bodies. There were no discernible fingerprints on any potential weapon. There was no sign of forced entry, no jimmied windows or splintered door frames. There was no evidence of a struggle, and even the presumed murder weapon, the handleless hatchet found in the cellar, was forensically useless. Its blade was clean, its surface covered in a fine gray ash. And in the middle of all that damning uncertainty stood Lizzie Borden, composed, uninjured, and claiming almost total ignorance of the events. Her alibi was specific yet porous. She claimed she had been in the barn, searching for a piece of lead to use as a fishing sinker, at the very time her father was being murdered on the settee. But the heat that day was sweltering, well over 90 degrees. The loft of the barn, where she claimed to have been eating pears and looking through old boxes, would have been an oven of trapped, dusty air. When investigators examined it, they found the thick layer of dust on the floor lay undisturbed. There were no fresh footprints. Her story didn't hold up to scrutiny, but neither did the physical evidence against her. The prosecution could not place a weapon in her hand. They could not find a single drop of blood on her clothing, her skin, or anywhere she claimed to have been. The sheer violence of the acts, a combined 30 blows with a heavy, sharp weapon, would have almost certainly produced a fine aerosol of blood and tissue, a spray that would have been impossible to avoid. And yet she was pristine. That is the first and most fundamental axis of suspicion, a crime scene that refuses to tell the truth. It is a vacuum of evidence, a void into which a century of speculation has been poured. If motive cannot be proven by physical evidence, it must be sought in the much murkier territory of the human mind. By all public accounts, Lizzie Borden was a model of respectable Victorian womanhood. She was intelligent, reserved, and devoutly religious. She taught Sunday school to immigrant children. She was an active member of the Woman's Christian Temperance Union, and she participated in numerous local charities. But she also lived in a pressure cooker, a house ruled by the iron fist of her father's control. Andrew Borden ruled by thrift. He refused to install modern plumbing. He denied the family luxuries that their immense wealth could have easily afforded. He kept his daughters, both grown women, in a state of extended, infantilizing financial dependence. Lizzie was 32 years old, unmarried, and trapped in a social world where a woman's independence was tied directly to her father's will and her prospects of marriage. There are those who argue that she simply snapped. This is the theory of repressed rage. In this view, years of simmering resentment over money, over control, over her diminished social standing, over the presence of her stepmother, built like steam behind the closed doors of that house until the morning of August 4th, 1892, when intense pressure finally met with opportunity. There was no intricate plot, no master plan. There was just a sudden, violent release. It was not about theft or an outside intruder. It was about the eruption of a lifetime of frustration. It was cold, sudden, and irreversible. Others argue for a different psychological motive, one that is not rooted in rage, but in cold, calculating fear. In this view, her father's recent dealings with Abby's family, particularly the transfer of real estate, threatened to disinherit Lizzie and Emma completely. Lizzie, seeing her future and her financial security slipping away, acted not out of emotion, but out of strategy. The murders, in this light, were not a crime of passion. They were a ruthless, preemptive strike, a brutal business decision disguised as madness. That is the second axis of suspicion, deep seated resentment, sharpened to a fine point by desperation. Bridget Sullivan, the Borden family's Irish maid, was the only other person in the house during the murders. She was a key witness, yet her testimony is a study in what was not seen and not heard. She had been washing windows in the yard, feeling unwell from the family sickness, when the first murder, the killing of Abby Borden, most likely took place upstairs. When questioned, she insisted she heard no screams, no heavy steps, no sound of a struggle at all. But some neighbors later claimed they saw her talking with Lizzie on the back steps after Andrew had returned home. If that was true, she might have been only feet away from the sitting room, perhaps while blood was still dripping from the ceiling of the room above her. Did Bridget know more than she said? Was her silence a form of loyalty to Lizzie, or was it born of fear? In the rigid class structure of 1892, and especially in Ireland where she was from, domestic servants were expected to be invisible. Their survival depended on their ability to see nothing, say nothing, and hope that the troubles of the house did not turn against them. To speak out against one's employer, especially one accused of murder, would have been an unimaginable risk. Years after the trial, Bridget Sullivan returned to her native Ireland and later moved to Montana. She never spoke publicly of the murders again. Her silence is a blank page in the middle of the story. That is the third axis of suspicion. A witness who heard nothing, and perhaps for her own safety, knew too much to say. If not Lizzie, then who? The search for an alternative suspect has been a century long obsession. Some have pointed a finger at Emma, the quiet elder sister. She was out of town during the murders, staying with friends in Fairhaven, over 15 miles away, a seemingly ironclad alibi. But rumor has a long reach. Emma and Lizzie shared a deep resentment toward their stepmother, and Emma, like Lizzie, stood to inherit half of Andrew's vast estate. Some theorists suggest they planned the murders together, with Emma's absence carefully timed to provide her with an alibi and leave Lizzie to do the terrible work. The later permanent split between the sisters in 1905 is often cited as evidence of a guilty secret that finally tore them apart. Others have looked to John Morse, the visiting uncle, who conveniently slept in the guest room the night before and left just before the murders began. He had a financial relationship with Andrew, and his alibi, visiting a relative across town while it checked out, still left many feeling uneasy. The murders happened in the narrow, perfect window between his departure and the discovery of Andrew's body. Still, there was no motive ever established, and no evidence found against him, only the unnerving whisper of coincidence. Then there were the persistent rumors of a mysterious outsider, Some theories point to an illegitimate son of Andrew Borden, an unknown young man named William, who supposedly came to the house seeking recognition or revenge. While there are tantalizing, unconfirmed accounts of such a person existing, no concrete evidence has ever surfaced to prove his involvement or even his existence. And so each theory folds into the next, creating a hall of mirrors without end, where every reflection is a possibility, but none are solid. The final and perhaps most crucial axis of suspicion is not about blood, motive, or opportunity, but about gender and perception. In the 1890s, a woman of Lizzie Borden's class and background was not expected to be violent. She was expected to be pious, domestic, fragile, and morally superior to men. The idea of such a woman committing a brutal, bloody double murder was not merely shocking to the Victorian mind, it was almost unthinkable, a violation of the natural order. Many historians and legal scholars believe this powerful cultural bias is what ultimately saved her from conviction. The defense, led by George Robinson, masterfully played on this prejudice. They never had to prove who did commit the murders. They only had to make the jury believe that she was not capable of it. To the all male jury, the image of a quiet, respectable, church going woman lifting a heavy axe again and again to butcher her own father was a concept so foreign, so grotesque, that it bordered on the mythological. If the killer had been a man or a woman of a lower social class, the circumstantial evidence might have been enough. But in 1893, in a New England courtroom, a woman of good standing could not easily be imagined as a monster. That is the fifth axis of suspicion, the profound and perhaps willful blindness of expectation. More than a century later, the Lizzie Borden case remains suspended in a perfect, chilling equilibrium between fact and myth. We have the court testimony, we have the police reports, we have the stark, haunting photographs of the crime scene, but we do not have the truth. Historians still debate the meaning of that elusive truth. Was it repressed rage, a sudden explosion after years of confinement? Was it cold, calculated greed for an inheritance? Was it a desperate act of a woman who felt her future being stolen from her? Or was it something too ordinary and too sad to fit into a grand legend? A simple family feud that went one terrible breath too far. Whatever it was, it changed Fall River forever. The house on 2nd Street still stands today, preserved as a museum of memory and a monument to speculation. Visitors walk the same narrow halls, stand at the foot of the bed where Abby fell, and linger in the sitting room where Andrew met his end. They come looking for answers, for a sense of resolution, but they leave only with questions, questions that are older than guilt itself. When you strip away the myth of the monster, the nursery rhyme, and the legend of the unreadable woman, what remains is something far more common and perhaps far more chilling, a ledger. It is a book of accounts filled with columns of money, entries of land, and the silent, unforgiving mathematics of the Borden family. At the heart of this story, beneath the layers of blood and speculation, lies not only the act of murder, but the fundamental question of who was meant to own what when Andrew Borden, a man who counted every penny, finally died. To understand the why, we must first understand the numbers. Andrew Jackson Borden was a man who believed that money, like morality, should never be wasted. His fortune, estimated at the time of his death to be around $300,000, the equivalent of nearly $10 million today, was a testament to a lifetime of relentless accumulation and iron willed thrift. He lived far below his means, a man of immense wealth residing in a modest, uncomfortable house on a street known more for its butcher shops and factories than for its social prestige. To his daughters, this thrift felt less like a virtue and more like a punishment. Lizzie and Emma grew up watching their friends and peers move to the grand hilltop homes of Fall River's elite. The Durfees, the Chases, the Braytons. These were the families who lived in sprawling Queen Anne and Italianate mansions with manicured lawns, gas lighting, and modern indoor plumbing. The Bordens remained below the hill, trapped not by a lack of funds, but by their father's stubborn pride in his own austerity. It wasn't poverty, it was the deliberate denial of comfort. And for Lizzie, a woman with social aspirations and a keen awareness of her family's standing, that denial became a slow, grinding humiliation. Friends and acquaintances recalled her quiet bitterness on the subject, her insistence that her father could afford better, that their home was an embarrassment. But Andrew Borden valued control above all else, especially the approval of others. Every penny he saved, every modern convenience he refused to install, was another brick in the fortress of his own power. And power in that house was the only currency that truly mattered. His money was not just a measure of his success, it was the primary tool he used to manage and dominate his family. In 1887, 5 years before the murders, Andrew made a financial decision that would permanently alter the emotional landscape of his family. He gave a house on 4th Street, which he owned, to his wife, Abby, a gift likely meant to secure her comfort and appease her side of the family. A year later, Abby, now the legal owner, transferred that property to her own half sister, Sarah Whitehead. To an outsider, it was a simple, generous act. But to Lizzie and Emma, it was an insult wrapped in the language of generosity. It was the first tangible proof of their deepest fear. Their father's money, their rightful inheritance, was now being moved outside the Borden bloodline and into the hands of their stepmother's kin. The daughters protested. The confrontation was not loud, but it was firm. They presented a united front, demanding to know why Abby's family was being favored over them. In response, Andrew attempted to restore fairness, or what he thought fairness meant. He purchased their maternal grandfather's former home, a property on Ferry Street, and deeded it to his daughters for the token sum of $1. Lizzie and Emma promptly sold the property back to their father for $5,000 in cash. The gesture of receiving a house had been transformed into a cold, hard financial transaction. It solved nothing. Instead, it drew the family's emotional map more sharply than ever before. Abby's side had been given a home. The daughters had been bought off. From that point on, the Cold War inside the Borden home became visible in every act of avoidance. Lizzie and Emma began taking their meals separately. They locked their bedroom doors, and most pointedly, Lizzie stopped addressing Abby as mother altogether. The financial slight had severed the last fraying thread of familial pretense. Rumor has always been the lifeblood of the Lizzie Borden case, and one of the most persistent and powerful rumors that circulated both before and after the trial was that Andrew Borden had been preparing to write a new will. No formal document was ever found, but several witnesses, including close business associates, later claimed that they had heard him mention arranging his affairs in the weeks leading up to his death. The family's lawyer, Andrew Jennings, would testify that Mr. Borden had indeed visited his office to discuss legal matters, though he would not disclose the specifics. If such a will existed or was in the process of being created, and if Abby was named the primary beneficiary, the legal situation for Lizzie and Emma would have been dire. Under Massachusetts law at the time, if Andrew died without a will, his estate would be divided, with Abby receiving a significant portion, but with the bulk eventually passing to his daughters. However, if he wrote a will that left the majority of his estate to his wife, Lizzie and Emma could have been almost entirely disinherited. Upon Abby's death, that fortune would then pass to her relatives, not to them. Some theorists argue that this fear, the imminent threat of disinheritance, of being left financially trapped and dependent on the charity of their stepmother's family, was the true spark that ignited the violence. In this interpretation, the murders were not an act of passionate hatred, but of desperate survival. It was a cold, brutal calculation, not a frenzied loss of control. The goal was to stop the will from ever being signed. Theories like that make people uneasy because they sound too logical, too calm for the sheer horror of the crime itself. And yet, logic and horror have often been found living side by side. For a woman in the 1890s, especially an unmarried one from a respectable family, financial independence was nearly impossible. There were only a few paths available: a strategic marriage, a substantial inheritance, or, in rare cases, employment in a handful of socially acceptable professions like teaching. Lizzie Borden was unmarried, and at 32, her prospects in the small insular society of Fall River were fading. Her sister Emma, at 42, was even further from the possibility of marriage. Both were completely dependent on their father's money, living on allowances that he controlled and could revoke at any time. In the culture of the time, a woman without her own wealth was effectively a guest in her own life, subject to the whims and authority of the male head of the household. Lizzie's active participation in church societies and charitable organizations was more than just a hobby. It was her way of building a separate identity, of gaining a measure of control and respect in a world that offered her very little of it. But control, like property and money, was something Andrew Borden never gave away freely. He held it, he guarded it, and he used it to keep his daughters in a state of perpetual childhood. And so, beneath the quiet moral surface of that tidy, respectable home was a silent but relentless economic war. A father guarding his hard won fortune as a symbol of his power, a daughter guarding her future against the threat of being left with nothing, and a stepmother caught in the middle, the unwitting symbol of that threat. After the murders of Andrew and Abby, the question of the inheritance was settled, not by a will, but by the cold, impartial hand of the law. Because Andrew died after Abby, even if only by an hour and a half, his estate legally absorbed her portion. And since he had no will, his entire fortune passed directly to his next of kin, his daughters, Lizzie and Emma. In an instant, they became two of the wealthiest women in Fall River. But even this final grim division did not end the bitterness. The money that had bound them together in their resentment now seemed to drive them apart. Emma, who had been Lizzie's staunchest defender, soon began to distance herself. The sisters separated their finances within a few years, and in 1905, Emma abruptly moved out of Maplecroft, the grand house on the hill that Lizzie had purchased, the very house that symbolized everything her father had denied her. It was the life Lizzie had always wanted, a life of luxury, independence, and social standing. But it was a life built on the ashes of everything she had lost, and a life she was forced to live in near total isolation. Neighbors said she kept servants, hosted theater friends from out of town, and lived quietly, but never, it seemed, happily. When Emma was asked later in her life by a reporter if she believed her sister was guilty, her reply was a masterpiece of damning silence. She said only, "I must not answer that question. Money had divided the family in life, and silence finished the job in death." The Lizzie Borden case is often told as a story of shocking, inexplicable violence. But beneath that violence is perhaps the oldest and most familiar story of all, the story of inheritance and power. It asks a simple, timeless question: how much control over another person's life can one individual truly claim before the weight of that control breaks them both? The Borden murders were not the sudden eruption of madness in an otherwise peaceful home. They were the final, bloody entry in a book that had been written for years, in property deeds, in family grudges, in bitter resentments, and in words left unspoken across the breakfast table. And long after the blood was cleaned from the carpets and the settee, the grim arithmetic remained. Numbers were balanced, lives were unbalanced. The ledger was settled. Andrew Borden built his fortune by saving every cent, by guarding every asset. But in the end, the one thing he could not save, the one thing his money could not control, was his own family. In the long, tangled history of the Lizzie Borden case, filled with its bloody axes and locked doors, there are few moments as small and as enormous as the burning of a simple house dress. It did not happen during the chaos of the murders, nor during the formal theater of the trial. It happened in the strange, suspended limbo between them, a quiet Sunday morning when the house on Second Street was no longer a home but a sealed exhibit, a place watched by the law and dissected by public opinion. The bodies of Andrew and Abby Borden had been buried. The national press had for a moment scattered, and the town of Fall River had settled into the uneasy, watchful silence that follows a great and terrible noise. But inside the Borden kitchen, a fire still burned, and into that fire a crucial piece of the story would be cast, turning from fabric to ash and from evidence to legend. It was Sunday, August 7th, 3 days after the murders. The house was occupied by Lizzie, her sister Emma, who had rushed back to Fall River upon hearing the news, and their close friend, Alice Russell, who had been staying with them for comfort and support. The police had already combed the house multiple times, collecting clothing, shoes, handkerchiefs, and anything else that might hold a microscopic trace of blood. On that quiet morning, Alice Russell entered the kitchen and found Lizzie standing before the cast iron stove. In her hands was a blue cotton Bedford cord dress. It was not an elegant garment, not something worn for social calls. It was a common, everyday house dress, the kind a woman would wear while performing her morning chores. Without ceremony, without a word to anyone, Lizzie opened the stove's mouth and began feeding the dress into the flames. Alice Russell, watching from the doorway, felt a chill run through her despite the summer heat. This was not an idle act. It felt deliberate, final. She stepped forward, a woman's voice, quiet and uneasy like Alice's. "Lizzie, what are you doing?" Lizzie turned, her expression, as Alice would later testify, perfectly calm. Lizzie's voice, matter of fact, "I am going to burn this old thing. It is covered with paint." The flames took the fabric quickly, a small, steady blaze that swallowed what could have been evidence or what could have been innocence, depending entirely on who was watching. Alice Russell said nothing more at that moment. She was a loyal friend caught in an impossible situation. But later that day, her conscience heavy, she confessed what she had seen to the police. And with her testimony, the uneasy silence of Fall River was shattered. The town was no longer just suspicious. It now had an image to anchor its suspicion upon. To the investigators, the burning of the dress was more than just suspicious. It was a brazen act of defiance, or a foolishly transparent attempt to destroy evidence. They had been grappling with one of the central paradoxes of the case. How could a killer commit such frenzied, bloody attacks and emerge without a single spot of blood? Lizzie's clothing on the morning of the murders had been, by all accounts, spotless. The police who first arrived saw no stains. Bridget Sullivan saw no stains. Lizzie herself claimed she was clean. The question of what she was wearing became critical. Lizzie's own account was confusing and changed over time. She initially claimed she had been wearing a light blue wrapper that morning, but later seemed to suggest she had changed into a pink wrapper before the police arrived. Other witnesses recalled her in a simple blue dress. The timeline was fragile, the witness memories conflicted under the stress of the day. And now, the one piece of physical evidence that could have confirmed or disproved her story, the dress she wore during the crucial morning hours, was ash. The press seized on the story instantly. Headlines across the country called it the dress of death. It was a tantalizing cinematic detail that fueled public speculation. Some said she had burned it to hide the fine mist of blood spatter that must have covered her. Others, her defenders, argued that it was an innocent act, misinterpreted by a town already convinced of her guilt. Perhaps she had simply burned an old paint stained dress, her mind too consumed with grief to consider how the act might look to outsiders. A third theory emerged, that she had burned it as an act of defiance, a way to reclaim control over her own narrative and her own home, after days of being intruded upon by police and gawking neighbors. But whatever her reason, the image of a woman calmly feeding fabric to the flames became immortal. It was fire as cleansing, fire as guilt, fire as an act of will. The physical act lasted only minutes. Its echo has lasted for more than a century. After that Sunday morning, the atmosphere inside the Borden home became even more charged. The act of burning the dress created a rift, not just with the investigation, but within the small circle of those still loyal to Lizzie. Bridget Sullivan, who had endured the horror of the discovery and the endless probing questions of the police, left the household soon after. She had seen and heard enough. The house, she felt, was haunted not by ghosts, but by a terrible unspoken knowledge. Emma remained loyal to Lizzie, at least for a time. She stood by her sister, even corroborating the story that the dress was old and paint stained. But even she began to retreat from the tightening circle of public and private scrutiny. Visitors to the house in the days that followed spoke of the oppressive silence within its walls, as though the very air was waiting for someone to confess, to break the unbearable tension. The dress was gone, but the idea of it, the proof of something hidden, something deliberately consumed by fire, hung over the house like smoke that would not clear. And from that moment on, every dress Lizzie wore, every public appearance she made, was seen through that hazy, incriminating filter. No matter how fine the silk or how somber the black, in the public imagination, people saw only the ashes of what was missing. In literature and in mythology, the act of burning an object is an act of profound transformation. It is how characters attempt to destroy their guilt, to hide their shame, or to begin their lives anew from the ashes of their past. But in Fall River, there was no transformation for Lizzie Borden. There was only the slow petrification of her story. The burning of the dress did not free her from suspicion, it cemented it. The town, and later the world, became forever fixated on that one moment, staring into the flames of one woman's kitchen stove. The dress became a metaphor for the case itself. It was a tangible object that, once destroyed, became an infinitely more powerful symbol. It represented all the missing evidence, all the unanswered questions, all the truths that were consumed before they could be examined. Every attempt to destroy the past only made it more permanent. And so, when people tell the story of Lizzie Borden today, they remember not only the acts, the symbol of the crime's brutality, but also the flame, the symbol of its mystery. Because history is not written by the innocent or the guilty alone, it is written by what remains. And in this case, what remains is not a clean, verifiable truth, but a lingering, haunting shadow, a blue dress that no longer exists, and a fire that never really went out. In the quiet, lonely hours after her acquittal, Lizzie Borden would sometimes sit alone in the grand parlor of Maplecroft, her new home on the hill. She would write letters, read theater programs, and listen to the sounds of the city drifting up through her open windows. The world, in many ways, had moved on. The trial was over, the headlines faded, but she had not. She was frozen in time, forever the woman from the house on 2nd Street. Outside, Fall River kept its distance, a town that could forgive its dead, but not the living who were left behind under a cloud of suspicion. Every creak in the floorboards of her new home, every whisper from beyond her gate, was a reminder that some verdicts are never truly final. And so the legend endured, passed down not in courtrooms, but in the ordinary, powerful acts of collective memory. A chilling rhyme sung by children on a playground, a ghost story whispered by a firelight, a name that would never again find peace. The small, bright flame that consumed a simple blue dress still flickers in every retelling of her story, not because it proved her guilt, but because it perfected her mystery. And that, perhaps, in the end, was Lizzie Borden's final, chilling act of control. And that's a wrap on this story. But our library is always growing, and we've got so many more tales to share with you. If you enjoyed this, help us bring more stories like it to life by hitting that like button. It tells YouTube you want to see more content like this. And if you're new here, don't just be a stranger. Hit subscribe and become part of our storytelling family. To make sure you're always here for premiere night, ring that notification bell. It's the only way to guarantee you won't miss our next upload. Got a friend who loves a good story? Share this video with them. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the comments. As the final shadows fall on this story, if you found yourself drifting away or simply appreciate a quiet mystery, consider subscribing to Midnight Narrative. Gently tap that like button to help more quiet seekers find us. And for more stories to help you unwind, explore our other videos right here. Don't forget to ring the notification bell if you wish to be softly alerted when a new narrative begins. Until next time, may your sleep be deep and your mysteries shallow.